Welcome, friends. After a tiring day, welcome to Mysterious Sleep Stories, a sanctuary of tales. I'm here to guide you and your curious souls through corridors where time flows differently. We visit places where history has left deeper traces than in most places, where the past and present intertwine in ways that are difficult to explain. Before we begin our story, friends, if you enjoy our stories, you can become a part of this journey by subscribing. If you have a place, a mystery, or a story you'd like to hear, write to us in the comments. Now, take a deep breath and let's begin. Tonight, we journey to a place where sleep comes reluctantly, or perhaps never. A magnificent old building standing like a sentinel on Michigan Avenue in Chicago. Its walls remember everything. The echoes of centuries-old footprints still reverberate in the marble corridors, and room 441 in particular has gained fame as a threshold between worlds. This is not a story designed to frighten, but rather an exploration of memory itself, of consciousness trapped in stone and wood, of powerful moments etched into reality in ways we are only just beginning to understand. The Congress Plaza Hotel across from Grant Park, with its Beaux-Arts facade, has remained fundamentally unchanged, witnessing over 130 years of human drama, triumph, tragedy, celebration, and sorrow as it has watched the city around it change. Within its walls, presidents have shaped history, gangsters have conducted their dark dealings, families have celebrated joyous occasions, and some souls have met tragic ends. All this experience, all this intense human emotion and activity has been woven into the building structure layer by layer over decades, so much so that the hotel seems to have developed a kind of awareness. So now, settle in, slow and deepen your breathing, and let your mind wander through the dimly lit corridors illuminated by flickering wall sconces, past ornate ballrooms where sometimes ghostly music plays, to elevators that move by themselves between floors, and finally to the fourth-floor hallway leading to a brass door, numbered 441, that seems longer than it should be. Come, let's explore together the Still Awake Hotel, the building that can't seem to learn how to escape its past, and the room where the line between the living world and what lies beyond is particularly thin. This journey will take us through more than a century of history, through triumphs and tragedies, through the perspectives of skeptics and believers, through scientific investigations and personal experiences. We will walk down corridors where Al Capone once walked, stand in rooms where presidents slept, and try to understand what it means for a place to be haunted, whether by real ghosts or simply by the weight of accumulated memories. Relax. Let the mystery unfold at its own pace. There's no rush here, no deadline, just the slow unfolding of a story waiting to be told. As patient as a building can be, for it knows that time works differently for structures of stone and steel than for creatures of flesh and bone. Part 1. The Awakening. Understanding haunted spaces. There's something fundamentally different about hotels that distinguishes them from almost every other type of building humans construct. They're not quite homes, not quite public spaces, but exist in a strange liminal zone that makes them unique in the architecture of human experience. A home is designed for permanence, for a single family or individual to occupy over many years, to fill with their own belongings, their own routines, their own sense of identity. A home becomes an extension of the people who live there, shaped by their presence in thousands of small ways. Public buildings like libraries, courthouses, or office buildings have their own character, but they're designed for daytime use, for specific functions, for crowds of people moving through them during business hours before they empty out at night. There's a transactional quality to these spaces. You enter them to accomplish something specific, then leave. They're not designed for the intimate aspects of human life, the sleeping, the bathing, the vulnerable moments when we let our guards down. Hotels occupy a different category entirely. They're temporary shelters designed to provide the intimate functions of a home, sleeping, bathing, resting, but for an endless rotation of strangers who have no connection to the space beyond the few nights they occupy it. They're simultaneously public and private, familiar and alien, comforting and unsettling. You perform your most vulnerable activities in a hotel room, sleeping, undressing, showering, in a space that belongs to you for perhaps 24 hours before it's cleaned and given to someone else to do exactly the same things. This creates a unique, energetic signature, if we want to use that term. Thousands upon thousands of people cycle through hotel rooms over the years and decades, each bringing their own emotional states, their own experiences, their own consciousness into the space. People celebrate in hotels, honeymoons, anniversaries, victories. They mourn in hotels. Affairs end, business deals fall through, bad news arrives via phone call. They're born in hotels when babies arrive unexpectedly in the night. And yes, they die in hotels from natural causes, from suicide, occasionally from violence. All of this concentrated human experience, compressed into relatively small spaces and repeated endlessly over time, creates something unusual. If we believe that consciousness and emotion are simply electrochemical processes in the brain, then hotel rooms are constantly being bathed in these electromagnetic signatures, over and over, year after year. If we believe that materials can somehow absorb or hold onto energy, and there are both scientific theories and ancient traditions that suggest this might be possible, then old hotels become reservoirs of accumulated human experience. Now imagine a hotel that's been standing for 132 years, a building that opened its doors in 1893 to greet the flood of visitors attending Chicago's World's Columbian Exposition, a structure that has hosted everyone from presidents to gangsters, from honeymooners to spies, from the famous to the desperate. Imagine how much memory could accumulate in such a place. How many moments of intense emotion could soak into the very fabric of the building itself, into the limestone walls 18 inches thick, into the marble floors that have felt the footsteps of millions, into the wooden joists and floorboards that creak with the settling of more than a century. The Congress Plaza Hotel stands at 520 South Michigan Avenue in Chicago, a city that has always had a complicated relationship with its own history. Chicago burned almost completely in 1871, forcing it to rebuild from ashes and creating a city that's simultaneously very old and perpetually new. The Congress Plaza survived that fire by virtue of not yet existing, but it carries within it the determination of a city that refused to be destroyed, that rebuilt itself bigger and grander than before, that transformed disaster into opportunity. From the outside, approaching the hotel from Grant Park, You see a beautiful example of Beaux-Arts architecture, that style that dominated American public building in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The facade features ornate cornices and sculpted friezes, classical proportions, and careful symmetry. The kind of building that speaks of an era when grandeur wasn't considered excessive but rather appropriate, when buildings were designed not just for function, but for making a statement about civilization itself, about humanity's aspirations and achievements. The hotel rises in two distinct sections: the original North Tower from 1893 and the South Tower added in 1907, though they blend together seamlessly in the unified facade. Together, they create a massive presence on Michigan Avenue, occupying an entire city block, impossible to miss, impossible to ignore. The building announces itself as important, as permanent, as a structure that expects to be here long after we're all gone. And it has been. Most of the people who built it are dead. Most of the first generation of guests are dead. Several generations of staff have come and gone. But the building remains patient and enduring, outlasting the lives that briefly animated it. But step inside, particularly late at night, when the lobby's grand chandeliers cast long shadows across the Italian marble floors, and you might feel something shift in the air around you. The atmosphere becomes heavier here, denser, as if the space is saturated with something invisible but tangible. The sounds change. Traffic noise from Michigan Avenue fades away, replaced by the particular acoustic signature of a large, old building with high ceilings and hard surfaces. Your footsteps echo differently here than they do on ordinary city streets. Voices carry strangely, seeming to come from directions that don't quite make sense. The hallways stretch longer than they should, turning corners into shadowed passages that seem to lead somewhere beyond mere geography. Corridor after corridor extends through the building's various additions and renovations, each section built at a different time and not quite matching the others in ceiling height, floor level, or decorative style. Walking from one section to another, you might notice the transition. The carpet pattern changes, the wallpaper shift from one era's aesthetic to another's. The light fixtures suddenly belong to a different decade. It's like moving between different buildings that happen to occupy the same space, different time periods layered on top of each other. The elevators are their own experience. These aren't modern, silent machines that whisk you smoothly between floors. These are older systems, mechanical and honest about it, with cables that creak and groan, with machinery that announces its presence through sound and vibration. Riding up to the fourth floor, you might hear the counterweights moving behind the walls, might feel the car sway slightly as it rises. And sometimes, according to staff and guests, the elevators move on their own, arriving at floors where no one called them, opening their doors to empty corridors as if inviting invisible passengers to enter. This is a building that remembers. That's the overwhelming impression that strikes almost everyone who spends time here, especially those who work night shifts when the hotel is at its quietest, when most of the guests are asleep and the building itself seems to breathe, to settle, to make itself known in ways it can't when distracted by the bustle of daytime activity. The Congress Plaza remembers its opening in 1893, remembers the excitement of the World's Fair and the flood of visitors eager to see Chicago's triumph. It remembers the gangster years of the 1920s and 30s, remembers Al Capone and his associates conducting their shadowy business in these elegant rooms. It remembers World War II, when the government took it over and filled it with military personnel. It remembers every wedding, every funeral reception, every business deal, every love affair, every betrayal, every moment of joy, and every instant of despair that has unfolded within its walls. And of all the rooms in this vast hotel, all 871 of them spreading across multiple towers and additions, through different construction phases and architectural styles, one room remembers more than all the others. One room has become synonymous with the unexplained, with the persistent, with phenomena that resist easy dismissal. Room 441 sits on the fourth floor, down a corridor that many guests describe as peculiar even before they know which room they're approaching, as if the space itself announces that something here is different, something here doesn't follow the normal rules. The door to room 441 is ordinary enough at first glance. Dark wood, like most of the doors in this old hotel. A brass number plate with 441 engraved in classical numerals. A modern keycard lock that replaced the old mechanical locks years ago, though some guests report that even electronic locks behave strangely here, requiring multiple attempts before the light turns green and the mechanism clicks open. But this is just a door, just a threshold, nothing obviously unusual about it. Yet guests who've stayed in this room report that from the moment they cross that threshold, they know there's somewhere different. Not necessarily dangerous, not overtly threatening, but awake, conscious, aware of them in a way that an empty hotel room should never be. It's a feeling that's difficult to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. Not quite like being watched by another person, because there's no malice in it, no specific intention that you can detect. More like the room itself has a presence, a personality, an awareness that takes note of your arrival and decides how it feels about you being there. The phenomenon of room 441 raises fascinating questions about the nature of place and consciousness that philosophers and scientists have debated for centuries without reaching definitive answers. Can buildings think? Can rooms hold onto experiences the way our minds hold memories? These questions might sound absurd on their face. Of course, buildings can't think. Of course, inanimate matter doesn't have consciousness. Matter is just matter, arranged in various configurations, without awareness or intention. But neuroscientists tell us that memory is essentially neural pathways that fire in particular patterns, chemical and electrical processes that recreate past experiences. Memory isn't a thing that exists in some specific location in the brain. It's a process, a pattern, an activity. What if consciousness isn't limited to biological brains made of neurons? What if the right combination of materials, exposed to the right intensity of human emotion over enough time, could develop its own form of awareness? Not human consciousness, certainly, but something analogous, a building-level awareness that emerges from the complex interaction of structure, history, and the endless parade of human consciousness that moves through it. This might sound like pure speculation, like mysticism rather than science. But consider that we don't really understand consciousness even in biological systems. The hard problem of consciousness, why subjective experience exists at all, why there's something it's like to be you rather than just mechanistic information processing remains unsolved. Philosophers and neuroscientists have proposed various theories, from panpsychism, the idea that consciousness is a fundamental property of all matter, to emergent complexity theories. Consciousness arises from sufficiently complex information processing systems, but none have been proven definitively correct. If consciousness can emerge from the complex interactions of neurons, why couldn't something analogous emerge from the complex interactions of a building's materials, systems, and the electromagnetic signatures of thousands of human consciousnesses passing through it? The materials are different, the timescales are different, but the principle might be the same: complexity giving rise to something greater than the sum of its parts. Throughout history, people have intuited that certain places feel different. Sacred groves, where ancient peoples performed rituals and felt the presence of the divine. Battlefields, where so much violence and death occur that the land itself seems scarred. Ancient monuments that have witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, that have absorbed the prayers and fears of millions over thousands of years. These spaces seem to carry weight beyond their physical properties, seem to have a presence that can't be explained by just geography and architecture. Modern paranormal investigators often point to electromagnetic fields as a possible mechanism, suggesting that emotional events create measurable energy that can be detected long after the events themselves have passed. Electromagnetic field meters are standard equipment in paranormal investigation, used to detect variations that might indicate the presence of something unusual. The theory is that consciousness, being electrochemical in nature, generates electromagnetic signatures, and that these signatures can somehow be absorbed or held by the environment, particularly by certain types of materials. Skeptics counter, quite reasonably, that these are nothing more than psychological phenomena. Our pattern-seeking brains creating meaning from random stimuli, finding faces in clouds, and hearing voices in white noise. The human mind is exceptionally good at pattern recognition. It's one of our greatest survival adaptations. But this same capacity makes us prone to pareidolia, seeing patterns that aren't really there. We're primed to interpret ambiguous sensory input as meaningful, especially in contexts where we expect or fear something unusual. But stay in room 441 on a quiet Tuesday night, alone with your thoughts and the settling sounds of an old building, and you might begin to wonder. You might start to notice the way the temperature drops suddenly in one corner of the room for no apparent reason, the ambient temperature reading normal, but this one spot feeling 10 degrees colder. The way the bathroom faucet occasionally runs for just a few seconds before shutting off on its own, even though the handles are clearly in the off position and there's no one near them. The way you wake at exactly 3:17 in the morning, every single morning you're there, for no reason you can explain, pulled from sleep by nothing obvious, but finding yourself suddenly and completely awake, heart pounding slightly, senses alert. The way you feel watched, not with malice or immediate threat, but with the patient attention of something that has been waiting a very long time for someone to notice it. Hotels, by their nature, are transitional spaces. People pass through them, rarely staying more than a few nights before moving on to their next destination or returning home. This constant flow creates a unique energetic signature, Thousands of people's emotions and experiences layering on top of each other like sedimentary rock, building up strata of memory that get deeper and more complex with each passing year. Most hotels are too new or too frequently renovated for this accumulation to reach any kind of critical mass. Modern chain hotels are rebuilt or completely renovated every few years, stripping away the accumulated patina of use and starting fresh with new materials, new designs, new everything. But the Congress Plaza has been collecting these experiences since the dawn of the 20th century, and it has done so in a building made of materials that, according to some paranormal researchers and various spiritual traditions, are particularly good at holding onto energy. The original North Tower, completed in 1893, was constructed with 18-inch thick limestone walls. Limestone is sedimentary rock formed from the compressed remains of ancient marine organisms, coral, shells, skeletal fragments of creatures that lived hundreds of millions of years ago. It's literally made of what were once living things, compressed and transformed by geological processes into stone. Some paranormal investigators believe that limestone has unique properties when it comes to storing and releasing electromagnetic energy. The theory suggests that the crystalline structure of limestone, the regular patterns of calcium carbonate molecules, can capture and hold electromagnetic signatures in ways that other materials can't. This isn't established science. There are no peer-reviewed studies proving that limestone can store human consciousness or emotional energy. But limestone has been used in sacred and important buildings throughout human history, from the Great Pyramid of Giza to medieval European cathedrals, often specifically because it was believed to have special properties. The massive stones of the Congress Plaza, quarried from the earth more than 130 years ago and assembled into this grand structure, might serve as a kind of battery according to this theory, capturing and holding the electrical signatures of powerful emotional events that occur within the building. Every moment of intense fear, joy, love, rage, despair, triumph. All of these generate electrical activity in the brains experiencing them. And if the theory holds, some tiny fraction of that energy is absorbed by the limestone walls, held in the crystalline structure of the stone, creating a cumulative record of everything that has happened here. Walk through the lobby and you're walking across floors of Italian marble, another stone with a long history of use in sacred and important buildings across multiple cultures and time periods. The marble tunnel that once connected the Congress to the auditorium building across the street was called Peacock Alley, a lavishly decorated underground passage where the elite of Chicago society would promenade, showing off their finest clothing to each other. The tunnel is closed now, severed when Congress Parkway was widened in the 1950s, but its existence speaks to the ambition and grandeur of the hotel's original design. This wasn't meant to be just another hotel, just another place to sleep. It was meant to be a palace, a temple to hospitality and luxury, a space worthy of presidents and emperors. The South Tower, added in 1907, brought even more opulence and reinforced the hotel's reputation as one of Chicago's premier destinations. The Gold Room, with its gilded plasterwork and massive crystal chandeliers hanging from a ceiling 2 stories above the floor, was the first hotel ballroom in America to feature air conditioning, an extraordinary luxury at a time when most buildings relied entirely on windows and fans for cooling. The room was designed to host the most elegant events, to be a space where Chicago's elite could gather and see themselves reflected in the gilded surfaces, could feel themselves part of something grand and important. The Florentine Room, the Elizabethan Room, the Pompeian Room. Each of these spaces was designed to transport guests to different eras and locations, to create experiences that would linger in memory long after checkout. Each room was a complete artistic statement, with decorations and proportions carefully calculated to evoke specific emotional responses. This wasn't casual decoration. This was architecture as theater, space as experience, design as a tool for shaping consciousness and creating memories. But experiences can linger in more ways than one. When something intense happens in a space, when someone dies suddenly or feels overwhelming joy or experiences profound terror, some traditions and theories suggest that the space itself absorbs a portion of that experience. And if that space happens to be made of materials particularly suited to holding electromagnetic charges, in a building old enough and active enough to have witnessed thousands upon thousands of such moments, then perhaps what you have is not just a building, but a kind of consciousness. Not human consciousness. Certainly, whatever awareness the Congress Plaza might possess would be utterly alien to us, operating on different time scales, perceiving reality in ways we can barely imagine. But awareness nonetheless. A building that has become more than the sum of its materials, that has developed through sheer accumulated experience into something that can, in some limited way, perceive and respond to the presence of consciousness moving through it. Room 441 sits at the heart of all this accumulated memory. It's not the oldest room in the hotel. That distinction belongs to rooms in the original North Tower. It's not the most luxurious. The suites on higher floors offer better views and more space. It's not particularly notable in its physical features. The furniture is standard hotel issue, updated periodically over the decades, but never dramatically different from any other mid-range hotel room. The walls are painted a neutral color. The curtains are heavy, the kind that block out the city lights when drawn, providing the darkness needed for sleep. The bathroom is small but functional, with a shower tub combination and basic fixtures. On paper, in the hotel's inventory system, there's nothing special about room 441. But something happened in that room over the decades. Or perhaps many somethings, an accumulation of events that individually might not have been particularly notable, but that together crossed some threshold, reached some critical mass where the room itself changed, where it woke up in a way that it has never gone back to sleep from. Guests report being touched in the night, kicked hard enough to wake them suddenly, having the covers pulled off them despite no wind and no visible agency. They wake to find a shadowy female figure standing at the foot of the bed or hovering above them, a presence that vanishes when they fully wake or turn on the lights, but that feels entirely real in the moment. Electronics malfunction in specific, repeatable ways. The television turning on at 3 a.m., the alarm clock activating even when not set, lights flickering in patterns that don't match random electrical fluctuations. The temperature fluctuates wildly without any apparent cause, cold spots appearing and disappearing seemingly at random. Objects move on their own, keys and phones disappearing and reappearing in odd locations. And through it all, There's that sensation of being watched, of sharing the space with something that is very much present, very much aware, very much paying attention. The phenomenon isn't constant. Some guests spend the night in room 441 and experience nothing unusual at all, leading skeptics to argue that the room's reputation creates expectation and expectation creates experience. That people who know they're staying in a haunted room are primed to interpret normal hotel sounds and sensations as paranormal. And there's truth to this argument. Expectation absolutely influences perception, and the human mind is capable of constructing elaborate experiences from ambiguous stimuli when primed to do so. But enough people have reported enough similar experiences, often without knowing the room's history beforehand, that dismissing it all as pure imagination becomes increasingly difficult. The consistency of the reports is striking. Not identical, but featuring recurring elements that appear again and again across different witnesses, different time periods, different levels of prior knowledge about the room's reputation. The woman at the foot of the bed, the 3 a.m. wake-ups, the cold spot in the corner near the window, the faucet turning on by itself, the feeling of being watched. These specific phenomena recur with a regularity that suggests something more than random chance or pure suggestion. There's a certain poetry to the idea of a hotel room that never checks out its last guest, a room that has become a permanent residence for a consciousness that found it couldn't or wouldn't leave. Hotels are supposed to be temporary, each occupant leaving and making way for the next in an endless cycle of arrival and departure. But what if something or someone decided to stay? What if room 441 became a permanent residence for a consciousness that found it couldn't or wouldn't move on? What if the room itself, through some process we don't understand, became conscious enough to remember, to respond, to interact in limited ways with the living people who still cycle through it, night after night, year after year? The questions spiral outward from this single room into broader inquiries about the nature of consciousness, memory, time, and reality itself. But for now, to understand room 441, we must first understand the building that contains it. We must travel back in time to 1893, to a Chicago bursting with ambition and determination, to a city that was about to host the world and wanted to prove itself worthy of the attention. Part 2. Foundations of Memory. The birth of the Congress Plaza. To truly understand room 441 and the phenomena associated with it, we need to understand the building that contains it. And to understand the building, we must journey back to 1893, to a Chicago that was younger, rawer, more desperate to prove itself than the confident metropolis it would eventually become. This was a city barely 60 years old, a city that had been largely destroyed by the Great Fire of 1871, just 22 years earlier. A city that had rebuilt itself from ashes with a determination that bordered on defiance. Chicago in 1893 was a city with something to prove, and the world's Columbian Exposition was its chance to prove it on the world stage. The world's Columbian Exposition was officially meant to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Americas, though it opened a year late in 1893 due to the massive scope of preparation required. More significantly, it was Chicago's opportunity to demonstrate that it belonged in the conversation with New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, that it was more than just a rough-hewn frontier town, that it could match any city in the world for culture, innovation, and grandeur. Chicago had fought hard to host the fair, competing against New York City, St. Louis, and Washington, D.C. in a fierce political battle. When the city won the bid, it was determined to create something so spectacular, so unprecedented, that the entire world would be forced to acknowledge Chicago's arrival as a world-class metropolis. The result was the White City, a vast complex of gleaming white buildings constructed around a central lagoon, all designed in the Beaux-Arts style that emphasized classical symmetry, elaborate ornamentation, and overwhelming grandeur. The fair covered 690 acres in Jackson Park, featuring more than 200 buildings showcasing the latest technological marvels and cultural achievements from around the world. Over 27 million people visited during its 6-month run from May to October 1893, a staggering number considering the U.S. population at the time was only around 65 million. Visitors came from every continent, from royalty to common workers, all eager to see what was being called the greatest spectacle of the age. They saw the world's first Ferris wheel, designed specifically for the fair by George Washington Gale Ferris Jr., rising 264 feet and capable of carrying 2,160 passengers at a time. They saw early motion pictures in Thomas Edison's kinetoscope. They experienced the first all-electric kitchen. They saw exotic international pavilions showcasing the cultures of nations from around the world. They rode on the world's first elevated electric railway, traveling between fair buildings on tracks mounted high above the ground. Chicago needed hotels to house this flood of visitors, and developer R.H. Southgate saw an opportunity that was both financial and civic. The auditorium building, completed just 4 years earlier in 1889, was already one of Chicago's most impressive structures, a massive multi-purpose building designed by the legendary architectural team of Louis Sullivan and Dankmar Adler. It contained a state-of-the-art theater, office spaces, and a hotel, all integrated into a single unified structure that was considered one of the architectural marvels of the age. The auditorium's success demonstrated that Chicago could support truly world-class facilities, and Southgate decided to build an annex to its hotel, taking advantage of the auditorium's prestige while creating an independent establishment that could stand on its own merits. He commissioned architect Clinton J. Warren to design the building, with Sullivan and Adler serving as consultants to ensure that the new structure would complement rather than compete with their nearby masterpiece. Warren was a skilled architect who had begun his career with the firm of Burnham and Root, working on some of Chicago's earliest skyscrapers, before opening his own office in 1886. He brought to the project both technical expertise in the relatively new field of steel frame construction and an aesthetic sensibility shaped by his exposure to the Beaux-Arts movement that was then dominating American architecture. The design Warren created for what was initially called the Auditorium Annex was meant to harmonize with the auditorium building itself, while adding distinctive touches that would make the new hotel memorable in its own right. The building would feature the classical proportions and elaborate ornamentation of the Beaux-Arts style, with sculpted friezes depicting various allegorical figures, ornate cornices, and a carefully balanced facade that would announce its importance to anyone walking past on Michigan Avenue. The North Tower, completed in 1893, just in time for the fair's opening, rose 10 stories above Michigan Avenue, making it one of the taller buildings in that area of the city. For 1893, this was impressively tall, putting it among the first wave of Chicago's growing skyline. The building was constructed with a steel frame, a relatively new technology that had only been perfected in the previous decade and that allowed for much taller buildings than traditional load-bearing walls could support. Steel frame construction was one of the innovations that would make modern skyscrapers possible, and its use in the auditorium annex demonstrated that this was a forward-thinking project, not just another traditional hotel. But while the internal structure was cutting-edge steel, the exterior walls were massive limestone blocks, 18 inches thick, giving the building a sense of solidity and permanence that lighter, more modern materials couldn't match. This wasn't a building meant to be temporary or to be torn down in a generation when taste changed. This was a structure designed to last centuries, to become a permanent landmark in Chicago's urban fabric, to still be standing long after everyone involved in its creation had passed away. The interior was even more impressive than the exterior, designed to make visitors feel they had entered a palace rather than merely a hotel. The lobby featured floors of Italian marble, carefully selected for its subtle veining and warm color. The walls were decorated with ornate plasterwork, classical moldings, and medallions that required skilled artisans weeks to complete. Massive chandeliers hung from the high ceilings, each one containing hundreds of individual crystal drops that would catch and refract the light, creating rainbow patterns across the marble floors. These chandeliers were designed to use both gas and the still novel electric lighting, allowing the hotel to switch between systems depending on availability and cost. The underground tunnel connecting the hotel to the auditorium building was lined with more of that Italian marble and featured elaborate decorative elements that made it much more than a mere passageway. It was dubbed Peacock Alley, a reference to the fashionable crowd who would promenade through it, showing off their finest clothes like peacocks displaying their feathers. This wasn't just a practical connection between two buildings. It was a social space, a place to see and be seen, part of the hotel's appeal to Chicago's elite. When the hotel opened its doors in May of 1893, just in time for the World's Fair's inauguration, it was an immediate and overwhelming success. The 500 rooms in the North Tower filled quickly with fairgoers, many of them wealthy visitors from the East Coast or Europe who expected and received accommodations matching the finest hotels in New York, London, or Paris. The hotel's restaurants served elaborate meals prepared by French-trained chefs. The staff was trained to provide service that met the highest standards of hospitality. And the location, directly across Michigan Avenue from Grant Park with easy access to both the fairgrounds in Jackson Park and Chicago's growing downtown business district, was absolutely perfect. But the World's Columbian Exposition ended in October of 1893, closing with elaborate ceremonies that marked both the fair's conclusion and the end of an era. The White City would soon be dismantled, its temporary buildings torn down, its innovative exhibits packed away. The question facing the auditorium annex was whether it could sustain itself once the flood of fair visitors departed, whether Chicago's permanent population and normal tourist traffic could support such a grand establishment. The answer turned out to be yes, but it required expansion and evolution. By 1902, less than a decade after opening, the hotel's owners commissioned a 4-story addition to the south, expanding capacity and adding amenities that would attract long-term residents as well as transient guests. This first expansion demonstrated the hotel's success and its commitment to remaining a premier destination rather than declining into a second-tier establishment once the fair's excitement faded. Then in 1907, they commissioned a much larger southern expansion, this time designing a 14-story south tower that would dwarf the original building and transform the hotel into one of Chicago's most imposing structures. The architectural firm of Halliburton and Roche, one of Chicago's most prestigious, received the commission. William Halliburton and Martin Roche were masters of the Chicago School of Architecture, responsible for many of the city's most important buildings. For the Congress expansion, they chose to follow Warren's original design quite closely, matching the limestone facade, the classic ornamentation, and the overall aesthetic so that the new and old sections would read as a unified whole rather than as a piecemeal assemblage of additions. This expansion brought the hotel's room count to over 1,000, making it one of the largest hotels not just in Chicago, but in the entire Midwest. More importantly, it brought new public spaces that would become legendary in their own right, spaces that would host some of the most important social and political events in Chicago's history over the following decades. The Gold Room, completed as part of this 1907 expansion, was a ballroom of stunning opulence. The walls and ceiling were covered with gilded plasterwork, intricate patterns of classical motifs that caught and reflected light from every angle. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling that soared 2 stories above the floor, each chandelier containing thousands of individual crystals that had been cut and assembled by skilled craftsmen. The floor was polished hardwood, perfect for dancing. Classical columns supported the high ceiling, their surfaces also covered in that elaborate plasterwork. The overall effect was overwhelming. This was a room designed to make guests feel like royalty, like they had stepped into a European palace rather than a Chicago hotel. The Gold Room had another distinction that seems almost mundane now, but was absolutely revolutionary in 1907. It was the first hotel ballroom in America to be air-conditioned. Air conditioning in 1907 was a remarkable luxury, typically found only in the most advanced theaters and public buildings. The technology was expensive and complex, requiring large machinery and significant engineering know-how to implement correctly. The system used in the Gold Room wasn't like modern air conditioning. It was based on pumping cold air through large ducts, requiring a massive infrastructure of machinery in the basement. But the result was that guests could attend formal events in the Gold Room during Chicago's humid summers without the oppressive heat that made such gatherings uncomfortable in other venues. The hotel's owners believed that providing such extraordinary comfort would attract the most elite clientele, and they were absolutely right. The Gold Room became the premier location for high society events in Chicago, hosting everything from debutante balls, where young women from wealthy families were formally introduced to society, to political fundraisers where fortunes changed hands and careers were made or broken, to wedding receptions for the city's most prominent families. The room witnessed countless moments of triumph, celebration, romance, and drama over the decades that followed. Other ballrooms soon followed, each designed to evoke a different aesthetic and serve slightly different functions. The Florentine Room was decorated with Italian-inspired motifs, featuring elaborate frescoes and architectural elements that evoked Renaissance Italy. The Elizabethan room was designed to suggest Tudor England, with dark wood paneling and elements drawn from Shakespearean-era architecture. The Pompeian room featured murals inspired by the art discovered in the ancient Roman city of Pompeii, which had been extensively excavated in the 19th century and had sparked enormous interest in classical antiquity. Each of these spaces was designed to transport guests to another time and place, to create experiences that transcended the ordinary. This wasn't just about providing space for events. It was about creating memories, about giving guests something extraordinary that they would remember and talk about for years afterward. The hotel understood that it was selling more than just rooms and meals. It was selling experiences, status, the feeling of being part of something grand and important. In 1940, artist Louis Grell was commissioned to paint 13 murals for the lunettes, the semicircular spaces that were an architectural feature surrounding the grand lobby. Grell was a Chicago-based artist known for his murals and decorative work in various important buildings throughout the city. His first commission for the Congress showed various popular scenes around Chicago at the time: the lakefront, the parks, the emerging skyline. Later, under new ownership in 1952, Grell was commissioned again to paint the same spaces, this time incorporating Chicago figures and symbolism representing important trades significant to the city's growth. In one mural, Lady Liberty appeared holding the Chicago River's distinctive Y shape on her lap, a reference to the river's importance in the city's development. By 1908, the hotel had fully come into its own identity, separate from the auditorium building that had inspired its creation. The name was officially changed from the Auditorium Annex to the Congress Hotel, acknowledging both its location on Congress Street, now Congress Parkway, and its independence as an establishment. Later, it would become the Congress Plaza Hotel, the name it still carries today. The marble tunnel of Peacock Alley remained as a testament to the hotel's origins, though it would eventually be closed when Congress Parkway was widened in the 1950s, cutting through part of the hotel's original footprint and forever severing the physical connection to the auditorium building. Throughout the 1910s and 1920s, the Congress Plaza established itself firmly as one of Chicago's premier hotels, rivaling the Palmer House and other legendary establishments for prestige and prominence. It became known particularly as the home of presidents due to the remarkable number of U.S. presidents who stayed there or held significant events there. The list reads like a who's who of early 20th century American politics. Grover Cleveland, William McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, Woodrow Wilson, Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Franklin D. Roosevelt all walked these marble halls, slept in these rooms, met with advisors in these suites, made decisions that shaped American history within these limestone walls. Theodore Roosevelt's connection to the hotel is particularly significant for American political history. In June of 1912, he stayed at the Congress Plaza during the Republican National Convention, which was being held in Chicago at the nearby Coliseum. Roosevelt had served as president from 1901 to 1909, declining to run for a third consecutive term in accordance with a tradition established by George Washington. Instead, he had supported his chosen successor, William Howard Taft, expecting Taft to continue his progressive policies. By 1912, however, Roosevelt had grown increasingly disillusioned with Taft's presidency, believing that Taft had betrayed the progressive cause and allied himself with conservative elements of the Republican Party. Roosevelt decided to challenge Taft for the Republican nomination, setting up a bitter fight between the former president and the sitting president. When the Republican delegates at the convention chose Taft over Roosevelt, a decision that many Roosevelt supporters believed was achieved through political manipulation and procedural tricks, Roosevelt was furious. He stood on the balcony of his room at the Congress Plaza and addressed a massive crowd that had gathered in Grant Park across the street. In that speech, delivered with his characteristic passion and intensity, Roosevelt announced that he was leaving the Republican Party and would run for president as the candidate of a new progressive party, which the press would nickname the Bull Moose Party after Roosevelt's declaration that he was as strong as a bull moose. This speech, delivered from the Congress Plaza's balcony, fundamentally changed American political history. Roosevelt's third-party candidacy split the Republican vote in the 1912 election, allowing Democratic candidate Woodrow Wilson to win the presidency despite receiving only about 42% of the popular vote. The election demonstrated the power of third parties to influence outcomes even when they can't win outright, and it marked the beginning of a progressive movement in American politics that would shape the country's direction for decades to come. The hotel witnessed other historic moments as well. In October of 1916, when President Woodrow Wilson visited Chicago, suffragettes from the National Woman's Party staged a silent protest in front of the Congress Plaza. They held banners reading, "Wilson is against women," and other slogans supporting women's right to vote. The demonstration turned violent when an angry mob of men attacked the protesters, destroying their banners and threatening physical violence, while police officers looked on and, according to multiple newspaper accounts of the incident, laughed at the women's distress. The incident, which received significant press coverage, helped galvanize support for women's suffrage by demonstrating the hostility and violence that suffragettes faced. It became one of many incidents that built public sympathy for the cause, contributing to the momentum that would finally result in the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, guaranteeing women's right to vote. The hotel also attracted celebrities and cultural figures who shaped American entertainment and culture. In the 1930s, as the country struggled through the Great Depression, the Elizabethan Room was converted into a nightclub featuring a revolving bandstand. One of the most innovative entertainment concepts in the city at that time. The revolving stage allowed the band to face different sections of the audience throughout the performance, creating a more intimate and engaging experience. From 1935 to 1936, the hotel served as headquarters for an NBC radio show hosted by Benny Goodman, the king of swing, who was helping to popularize jazz music and the swing style that would dominate American popular music for the next decade. The sounds of big band music would have filled these halls during those years. The energy of hundreds of dancers moving across the ballroom floors, the excitement of live radio broadcast bringing the hotel's festivities to listeners across the nation. But the hotel's history wasn't all glamorous events and famous visitors. The 1920s and early 1930s were the era of prohibition in America, when the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol were illegal under the 18th Amendment. Chicago became the epicenter of organized crime during this period, as gangsters like Al Capone built enormous criminal empires based on supplying illegal alcohol to a public that had no intention of actually giving up drinking. The Congress Plaza's reputation includes persistent rumors and legends about its connections to Al Capone and the Chicago mob, though the exact nature and extent of these connections are matters of debate and uncertainty. Some stories claim that Capone owned the hotel, which isn't supported by historical records. The hotel's ownership during the 1920s and 30s is well documented, and Capone's name doesn't appear. Other stories say that Capone maintained a permanent suite on the 8th floor, using it as a base of operations for his criminal enterprises. This also isn't clearly documented, though it's more plausible than the ownership claim. What is documented and verifiable is that Capone was a frequent visitor to the hotel, that several of his employees and associates lived there on a long-term basis, and that the hotel's location, layout, and clientele made it useful for various aspects of mob business. The Congress Plaza, with its reputation as a high society hotel frequented by politicians and business leaders, was the perfect place for Capone to conduct business in plain sight. Who would suspect criminal activity in a hotel that hosted presidents? Who would question well-dressed men meeting in the hotel's restaurants or private rooms? According to local legend and some witness accounts that have been passed down over the decades, the hotel was sometimes used to hold rival gangsters hostage during territorial disputes or business negotiations. The layout of the building, with its multiple towers connected by corridors, its underground passages, its service elevators and back staircases, made it relatively easy to move people discreetly. A person could be brought into the hotel through a service entrance, taken up a back stairway to a room in a remote section of the building, held there for as long as necessary, and either released or dealt with more permanently, all without anyone in the public areas of the hotel being aware that anything unusual was happening. How many people died in the Congress Plaza during the gangster years of the 1920s and early 30s? There's no way to know for certain, and probably never will be. These weren't deaths that would have been reported to police or documented in public records. Bodies would have been removed discreetly through service entrances, taken out in laundry carts or moving trunks, dumped in the Chicago River, or buried in construction sites around the rapidly developing city. The hotel's official records, if they even mention such incidents, have long since been lost or destroyed. But employees who have worked at the hotel over the decades whisper about certain rooms and certain areas that feel particularly cold, particularly oppressive, particularly unwelcoming. The 8th floor, where Capone allegedly spent time, is one such area. Some staff members, even today, are reluctant to go there alone, especially during night shifts when the building is quiet and sounds carry strangely through the empty corridors. They report feelings of being watched, of sensing a presence that doesn't feel friendly or welcoming, of hearing sounds that don't have obvious sources. One of the ghosts most often associated with this gangster era is nicknamed Peg Leg Johnny. The story, as it's been passed down through hotel staff and local paranormal investigators, is that he was a homeless man who somehow made his way into the hotel and was killed there, either by gangsters who found him in the wrong place at the wrong time, or by hotel security who didn't want vagrants on the property during the hotel's upscale years. The nickname Peg Leg Johnny suggests he had a prosthetic leg, though no specific details about his actual identity or the circumstances of his death have ever been verified. His ghost is most often seen in the South Tower, appearing as a haggard man with one leg, sometimes using a crutch, sometimes hopping on his remaining leg. When approached or called out to, he vanishes, usually by simply fading away like morning mist or by turning a corner where witnesses find no corner exists when they follow. Some guests and staff report hearing the distinctive sound of someone walking with a prosthetic leg in the hallways late at night, an irregular, uneven gait with a particular rhythm, the sound approaching their door but never quite arriving before fading away. With the outbreak of World War II in Europe in 1939 and America's entry into the war following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the hotel's history took another dramatic turn. In 1942, the United States government purchased the Congress Plaza and converted it from a civilian hotel into headquarters and a training school for the Army Air Forces, the precursor to the modern U.S. Air Force. The grand ballrooms that had hosted debutante balls and swing dancing became mess halls and training spaces. The luxury suites where presidents had slept became offices for military commanders. The elegant hotel rooms housed young men in uniform, many of them just weeks or months away from being shipped overseas to fight in Europe or the Pacific. The building's transformation during this period must have been profound and jarring. Spaces designed for elegance and leisure were repurposed for military efficiency. The marble floors that had been polished to mirror brightness for dancing were now marked by thousands of military boots. The crystal chandeliers that had sparkled over formal dinners now illuminated rows of desks where clerks processed orders and filed reports. The building that had been designed to make guests feel like royalty was now processing ordinary young men through the machinery of modern warfare. One can only imagine what it must have been like for those young servicemen, many of them from small towns and rural areas who had never experienced anything like Chicago or a grand hotel, suddenly finding themselves living in what had been one of the city's most luxurious establishments. Did they appreciate the grandeur, or did it all feel alien and irrelevant given the circumstances that had brought them there? Did they wander the hallways at night, unable to sleep before shipping out, wondering if they would survive what was waiting for them across the ocean? The hotel reopened for civilian use in 1944, just in time for that summer's political conventions. The war was still ongoing. D-Day and the invasion of Normandy occurred in June 1944, and the fighting in both Europe and the Pacific would continue for another year. But the tide had turned, and there was optimism that victory was achievable. Chicago hosted both the Democratic and Republican national conventions that summer, bringing thousands of politicians, delegates, journalists, and hangers-on to the city, all needing hotel rooms. The Congress Plaza was ready to accommodate them, though the rapid transition from military use back to civilian hospitality must have been challenging. The post-war years brought new owners and extensive renovations as the hotel worked to restore its pre-war elegance while also updating its facilities to meet modern expectations. The Pick Hotel Corporation bought the property in 1950 and immediately undertook a massive modernization project. They updated the electrical systems throughout the building, replacing aging wiring and increasing capacity to handle the growing number of electrical appliances that guests expected. They renovated the plumbing, installing more modern fixtures and addressing issues that had accumulated during the war years when maintenance had been minimal. They added new suites and renovated existing rooms, updating furnishings and decorations to match post-war tastes while trying to preserve the classical elegance that had always been the hotel's hallmark. Another major modernization project began in the 1960s, reflecting the rapid changes in American society and expectations during that decade. This renovation added a new ballroom to accommodate larger events, installed escalators to supplement the aging elevator system, and continued the ongoing process of updating rooms and public spaces. With each renovation, some of the original character was inevitably lost. Old materials replaced with new, historical details covered over or removed, the patina of age scrubbed away in favor of contemporary cleanliness and efficiency. But despite these changes, despite all the renovations and updates, the bones of the building remained. Those thick limestone walls, those high ceilings, that sense of grandeur and permanence that no amount of updating could completely erase or replace. The Congress Plaza remained fundamentally itself, a grand old hotel that had witnessed and shaped more than half a century of Chicago history. The hotel changed hands several more times over the following decades. From 1987 to 2012, it was owned by a group of investors led by Israeli businessman Albert Nasser, who made additional improvements and tried to maintain the building's historic character while keeping it competitive in Chicago's increasingly crowded hospitality market. In 2012, it was sold to a joint venture of New York investment firms who own it to this day, continuing the tradition of periodic updates and renovations while preserving the essential historical character that makes the Congress Plaza unique. Through all these changes of ownership, through all the renovations and updates and modifications, through the transition from gas lighting to electric, from telephone operators to direct dial phones to internet connectivity, through all the technological and social changes that transformed America and Chicago over more than 130 years, the Congress Plaza has remained fundamentally itself. It has remained a grand old hotel with more than a century of memories soaked into its walls, with a reputation for elegance and historical significance, with a presence in Chicago's urban landscape that transcends mere real estate. But some of those memories, as we're about to explore in detail, are darker than others. Hotels are places where people are born and where people die, where celebrations happen alongside tragedies, where the full spectrum of human experience plays out in temporary rooms that witness it all. And the Congress Plaza, with its long history and its thousands of rooms that have hosted millions of guests over the decades, has witnessed more than its share of tragedy, violence, and death. These tragedies have accumulated layer upon layer, becoming part of the building's character, part of what makes it unique, and perhaps part of what makes certain rooms and certain areas feel different from others, feel haunted in ways that resist easy explanation or dismissal. It's time to talk about the deaths, about the tragedies that have marked the Congress Plaza's history and perhaps left permanent impressions on the building itself. Part 3. The Layers, Tragedy, and Death. Every building with a long history accumulates stories of death. It's inevitable, inescapable. People die. Sometimes they die in hospitals after long illnesses, sometimes at home surrounded by family, and sometimes in hotel rooms, far from everything familiar, far from anyone who loves them. The Congress Plaza has stood for 132 years. Tens of millions of people have passed through its doors during that time. Guests staying for a night or a week, staff working shifts that add up to decades, visitors attending events in the ballrooms. Given the laws of probability and the simple mathematics of human mortality, many thousands of those people have died, if not in the hotel itself, then shortly after leaving it, carrying with them whatever experiences and memories they accumulated within these walls. Most of these deaths were natural and unremarkable. The expected ending of long lives, the tragic but not unusual conclusion of illness or accident, an elderly guest dying peacefully in their sleep, someone suffering a heart attack, a person succumbing to cancer or pneumonia. These deaths, while sad for the families and friends involved, don't leave the kind of mark on a place that creates ghost stories. They're part of the normal flow of life and death, expected events that occur everywhere, including hotels. But some deaths are different. Some deaths are sudden, violent, or suffused with such intense emotion, fear, rage, despair, that they seem to leave a mark, an impression on the space where they occurred. These are the deaths that feed a building's haunted reputation, the stories that get passed from guest to guest, from employee to employee, growing and changing with each retelling until it becomes nearly impossible to separate fact from fiction, verified history from elaborated legend. Let's start with one of the most documented and heartbreaking tragedies in the Congress Plaza's history, the story of Adele Langer and her two young sons. In 1939, Europe was rapidly sliding toward the abyss of World War II. Germany had already annexed Austria in the Anschluss of March 1938 and had occupied Czechoslovakia in March 1939, breaking the promises made at the Munich Agreement just 6 months earlier. Jews across German-controlled territories were facing escalating persecution under the Nazi regime. The Nuremberg laws had stripped them of citizenship and basic rights. Kristallnacht in November 1938 had seen widespread violence against Jewish communities, with synagogues burned and businesses destroyed. The writing was on the wall for anyone willing to read it. Worse was coming, much worse. Adele Langer was a 43-year-old Jewish woman from Czechoslovakia who recognized the danger her family faced. She made the difficult, wrenching decision that many Jewish families across Europe were making in those dark months, to flee while escape was still possible. Taking her two young sons with her, 6-year-old Karel and 4-year-old Jan, she made the dangerous journey out of Nazi-occupied territory and across the Atlantic Ocean to America, to Chicago specifically, where she had a couple of aunts who could provide some support as the family attempted to start over in a new country where they didn't speak the language and had almost no resources. The plan, such as it was, involved Adele's husband Karel Sr. staying behind temporarily to sell whatever property and possessions the family still owned, to gather funds that would allow them to establish themselves in America. Then he would follow his family across the ocean, reuniting with his wife and sons in safety, far from the horrors that were already beginning to unfold in Europe. It must have been an agonizing decision, splitting the family, sending his wife and children away to safety while he remained behind in danger. But many families made similar choices in those desperate times, gambling that a temporary separation was worth the chance of survival. Adele and the boys checked into the Congress Plaza Hotel to wait for Carell Sr. to arrive. The hotel, with its grand lobby and elegant rooms, must have seemed both wonderful and alien to them. A symbol of American prosperity and safety, so different from the increasingly dark and dangerous world they had left behind. Days passed as they waited, then weeks. Carell Sr. didn't arrive. There was no word from him, no telegram explaining the delay, no letter reassuring them that he was on his way. Communication with Nazi-occupied Europe was becoming increasingly difficult and unreliable as the continent prepared for war. Mail was censored, phone lines were monitored, and as tensions escalated toward the outbreak of war in September 1939, even these limited channels of communication began to break down. Adele found herself alone in a strange country with two young children who didn't understand why their father hadn't come, who kept asking when they would see him again, when they could go home. She couldn't find work. Her English was limited, her skills didn't translate to the American job market, and the Great Depression, while easing somewhat by 1939, had left the economy still struggling with high unemployment. The money she had brought from Europe was running low. The hotel bills were accumulating. Her aunts could provide some support, but they weren't wealthy and had their own families to care for. The weight of responsibility for her children's survival fell entirely on Adele's shoulders, and that weight was becoming unbearable. The stress must have been unimaginable. She was alone in a foreign country, unable to speak the language fluently, running out of money, with no word from her husband, watching her children's confusion and fear grow as their temporary stay stretched on indefinitely. She would have been hearing news about Europe, about the war that everyone knew was coming, about the persecution of Jews in German-controlled territories. She would have wondered about her extended family, her friends, everyone she had left behind. She would have wondered about Carell Sr. What had happened to prevent him from following them? Was he safe? Was he even alive? Under such crushing pressure, something in Adele broke. The exact timeline isn't clear from the historical records that have survived, but at some point in the late summer or early fall of 1939, her mental state deteriorated to the point where she could no longer function rationally. The fear, the isolation, the uncertainty, the weight of being solely responsible for her children's survival in impossible circumstances. It all became too much. One afternoon, she took Carell and Jan to the Lincoln Park Zoo, a pleasant outing that seemed entirely normal to the boys. They looked at animals, maybe bought peanuts to feed the elephants, enjoyed one of those ordinary childhood moments that become precious in retrospect. The zoo was then, as it is now, one of Chicago's beloved institutions, a place where children could experience wonder and joy. Carell and Jan had no way of knowing this would be their last afternoon, their last moments of childhood innocence before everything ended. Then they returned to the Congress Plaza Hotel, back to their room where they had been living for weeks or months. What happened next is difficult to recount even at this distance of more than 85 years, even knowing that everyone involved is long since dead. Once back in their room, Adele opened the window. Hotel windows in 1939 opened much wider than they do in modern buildings with their safety restrictions and codes designed to prevent exactly this kind of tragedy. They opened wide enough for someone to fall through or to be pushed through. Adele picked up 4-year-old Jan first. Did she say anything to him? Did she explain what was happening? Or did she simply act quickly before she could change her mind? We'll never know. She threw him out the window. Then she picked up 6-year-old Carell. He may have understood by then what was happening, may have struggled or screamed or begged his mother to stop. Or perhaps it all happened too fast for him to comprehend. She threw him out the window after his brother. Then Adele stood at that open window. She could see her son's bodies on the pavement below. She had just murdered her children. What went through her mind in those moments? Immediate regret and horror at what she'd done? Relief that they wouldn't have to face whatever hardships and dangers she had been fearing? Complete mental breakdown, making rational thought impossible? We can't know. But after some period of time, seconds, minutes, hours, she jumped after them. 3 bodies were found on the pavement below the Congress Plaza's North Tower. The police investigation was brief and straightforward. This was clearly a murder-suicide driven by maternal despair. There was no mystery to solve, no suspect to find. 2 young boys and their mother were dead. The case file was closed. The hotel cleaned up the scene. Life went on, as it always does after tragedy. The newspapers reported the incident. Czech refugee kills self and sons, read one headline. The articles were sympathetic to Adele's impossible situation. A refugee from Nazi persecution, separated from her husband, alone and desperate in a foreign land. But the sympathy didn't change the facts. 2 children were dead by their mother's hand, followed by the mother's suicide. It was a tragedy that shocked Chicago's small Czech immigrant community, a reminder of how the horrors happening in Europe were reaching across the ocean to destroy lives even of those who had escaped. But this is where the story begins to diverge from documented fact into something more uncertain, into territory where history fades and legend begins. Some accounts claim that when the 3 bodies were taken to the city morgue, only 2 arrived. Adele and Jan were accounted for in the official records, but Carol's body allegedly vanished somewhere in the process of transport or processing. The morgue had no record of receiving it, even though witnesses clearly saw 3 bodies at the scene. Whether this is true or a later embellishment is impossible to verify at this distance. Morgue records from 1939 are not easily accessible, and the chaos of processing multiple bodies from a tragic incident might have resulted in paperwork errors or oversights. Or perhaps the story of the missing body was invented later to explain or give weight to the paranormal phenomena that began to be reported. Because this is what's consistently reported by multiple sources over many decades. The ghost of a young boy, described as around 6 years old, has been seen running through the hallways of the Congress Plaza, particularly in the area of the North Tower where the Langers had their room. This ghost boy appears suddenly at the end of long corridors, runs toward witnesses or past them, then vanishes, sometimes through a wall, sometimes around a corner where there is no escape route, sometimes by simply fading away like morning mist in the sunlight. What makes these sightings particularly striking is how the ghost child is consistently described. He's not crying or screaming, not displaying the terror or confusion you might expect from a child who died so traumatically. Instead, he's usually described as grinning or laughing, as if playing a game, as if he's having fun. He appears happy, carefree, engaged in the eternal play that characterizes childhood. Some witnesses hear him laughing, that distinctive sound of child's laughter, echoing through corridors that should be empty. Hotel staff, particularly those who work night shifts when the building is quiet and sounds carry strangely through the empty hallways, have grown almost accustomed to these occurrences over the years. It's just Carell, they say when they hear running footsteps and children's laughter in sections of the hotel where no children are currently guests. He's playing. There's a matter-of-fact quality to how longtime employees discuss the ghost boy, an acceptance that this is simply part of working at the Congress Plaza, no more remarkable than dealing with broken air conditioners or noisy guests. The psychological mechanism that might create such a haunting, if we believe in such things, is both tragic and oddly beautiful to consider. If consciousness can somehow persist after death, and that's obviously a massive if that science has not confirmed, why would a child who died in such traumatic circumstances appear happy rather than distressed? Perhaps because in the moment of falling, he didn't understand what was happening. Perhaps death came so quickly that there was no time for fear or pain to register. Perhaps he simply went from the ordinary consciousness of a 6-year-old boy playing with his mother to whatever comes after without the terrible understanding that adults would bring to such a moment. Or perhaps, if we're speculating about ghosts and consciousness persisting after death, what remains is not actually Carol's consciousness as it was in the moment of death, but rather the hotel's memory of Carell, a replay of the moments when he was alive and happy, running through these halls with his brother during their weeks of staying here, before tragedy struck. Like a recording that plays on loop, showing only the happy times, edited to remove everything after. This interpretation, that ghosts might be more like recordings than actual conscious entities, is one theory in paranormal research, usually called residual hauntings. The idea is that traumatic or emotionally powerful events can somehow imprint themselves on the environment, and under the right conditions, these impressions replay like a film stuck on a loop. The ghost isn't aware of you watching it, isn't conscious or able to interact. It's just playing out the same actions over and over, trapped in an eternal repetition of a moment that has long since passed. But other witnesses report that the ghost boy sometimes seems to respond to them, making eye contact, changing direction as if playing chase, laughing as if aware of their presence. This would suggest an intelligent haunting, where actual consciousness persists and can perceive and interact with the living world. The distinction between residual and intelligent hauntings is important in paranormal research, though, of course, none of this is established science. It's all theoretical frameworks that paranormal investigators use to categorize experiences that may or may not have any objective reality. The tragedy of Adele Langer and her sons is one of the most well-documented incidents in the Congress Plaza's history because it was recent enough to appear in newspaper records, because it occurred in an era when record-keeping was systematic, and because the circumstances were dramatic enough to attract attention. But it's far from the only death the hotel has witnessed over its 132 years. Another documented death from much earlier in the hotel's history involves Captain Louis Ostium of the 1st United States Artillery. Captain Ostium had served with distinction in the Spanish-American War of 1898, earning respect for his military service and dedication to his men. He was by all accounts a capable officer, the kind of man who took his responsibilities seriously, who led by example, who embodied the military virtues of duty, honor, and service. In 1900, just 7 years after the hotel first opened its doors, Captain Ostium checked into the Congress Plaza alone. It was the eve of his wedding. He was scheduled to be married the following day to a woman whose name has been lost to history. This should have been one of the happiest times of his life, a celebration of love and the beginning of a new chapter. Instead, at some point during that night in his hotel room, Captain Ostium removed his service revolver and shot himself in the head. He left no note, no explanation, nothing that could help his family, friends, or military superiors understand why he had made this choice. His body was discovered by hotel staff the next morning when he failed to check out at the appointed time. The woman who was supposed to become his wife that day instead attended his funeral. The reasons for his suicide remain completely unknown more than 120 years later. Was he having second thoughts about the marriage? Had he received devastating news about his health or career? Was he suffering from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder from his experiences in the Spanish-American War, carrying psychological wounds that 1900-era medicine had no way to diagnose or treat? Did he have debts or scandals that were about to be exposed? We have no way to know. Captain Ostium took his reasons to the grave with him, leaving behind only questions and a sudden, shocking tragedy on what should have been a joyous occasion. The ghost attributed to Captain Ostium is known among paranormal investigators and hotel staff as the Shadow Man. Multiple witnesses over more than a century have reported seeing a dark, human-shaped figure moving through the hotel, particularly in the common areas and staircases. Unlike many ghostly apparitions that are described as translucent or glowing or obviously supernatural in appearance, the Shadow Man is described as simply a darker shadow among shadows, a human-shaped absence of light that moves with apparent purpose through the building. The sightings follow a consistent pattern. The Shadow Man appears at the end of a corridor or in a stairwell, seen in peripheral vision or glimpsed briefly before vanishing. When witnesses turn to look directly at the figure, it often disappears immediately. But some witnesses report longer encounters, watching the Shadow Man for several seconds before he fades away or turns a corner. He doesn't interact with witnesses, doesn't acknowledge their presence, just moves through the space as if on some errand that only he understands. One particularly dramatic encounter was reported by a security guard who was making his rounds late at night several years ago. He saw the Shadow Man at the end of a corridor and called out, asking if anyone was there, following standard security protocol for checking on people in areas where they shouldn't be after hours. The figure didn't respond verbally, but instead turned and ran. The guard gave chase, concerned that someone was in a restricted area, possibly attempting to burglarize rooms or engage in some other criminal activity. The pursuit went up staircase after staircase, floor after floor, the Shadow Man always staying ahead of the guard but visible enough to keep following. Finally, the chase led to the roof, the guard bursting through the rooftop access door, expecting to corner whoever he had been chasing. But when he emerged onto the roof, the figure had vanished. The guard searched the entire roof, which is flat and offers very little concealment. There was nowhere the figure could have hidden, no way down except past the guard. The roof access door was the only exit, and the guard had come through it immediately after the figure. But the roof was empty, the figure simply gone, vanished as if it had never existed. The guard reported this incident to his supervisors, who conducted their own investigation but found no evidence of anyone on the roof or in the stairwells. Security footage was reviewed but proved inconclusive. The lighting in the stairwells makes shadows confusing, and it was impossible to definitively see whether what appeared to be a figure is actually a person or just an artifact of the lighting and camera angle. The guard, who was known as reliable and level-headed, had no explanation for what he had experienced. He stood by his account, but acknowledged he couldn't prove what he had seen. This incident, which occurred within the last 2 decades according to interviews with hotel staff, has become part of the modern lore of the Congress Plaza, demonstrating that new ghost stories continue to emerge even now, that the building's haunted reputation isn't just based on historical accounts, but on ongoing experiences reported by contemporary witnesses. Then there's the story of the workman who allegedly died during the hotel's construction, though this account exists more in the realm of urban legend than documented history. According to the tale, during the construction of one of the hotel's early editions in the 1890s or early 1900s, a construction worker fell into a wall cavity and was accidentally plastered over, either because no one noticed his absence until the wall was completed, or because the construction schedule was too tight to allow for the delay that would have been caused by recovering the body and conducting an investigation. The evidence for this ghost is said to be a hand that periodically pushes through one of the walls in the hotel, visible for just a few seconds before vanishing back into the solid plaster. The location of this phenomenon is variously reported as being in the Gold Room, in one of the other ballrooms, or in a service corridor somewhere in the older sections of the building. The description is always similar. A human hand, sometimes just the fingers, pushing through solid wall as if the plaster were as insubstantial as a curtain, visible for a brief moment before withdrawing and leaving the wall apparently solid and undamaged. From a practical standpoint, it seems highly unlikely that a body could have been accidentally sealed into a wall without anyone noticing. The smell of decomposition alone would have been overwhelming and would have persisted for months, making it impossible to ignore. Construction workers would have known a colleague was missing. There would have been investigations, police reports, newspaper coverage. The story doesn't hold up to scrutiny as a factual account. But perhaps there was a construction accident that resulted in a death, just not literally entombed in the walls. Perhaps a worker fell from scaffolding or was crushed by a heavy stone block or died in some other construction-related accident. That death, tragic and shocking to his fellow workers, might have given rise to stories that were embellished over time, becoming more dramatic with each retelling until the literal death became a mythical entombment. Or perhaps the hand pushing through the wall is a visual representation of a broader truth, that the past is never fully sealed away, that what's buried in the history of a building has a tendency to push through into the present, making itself known in whatever ways it can. The image is powerful even if the literal story is unlikely. The dead reaching out from within the walls, trying to be acknowledged, to be remembered, to not be forgotten. Al Capone's relationship with the Congress Plaza is another area where documented fact blurs into legend and persistent rumor. Capone did not own the hotel, despite some claims to the contrary. The ownership records are clear, and his name doesn't appear. He did not have a permanent suite on the 8th floor, at least not in the sense of having a room registered in his name or being an official long-term resident. But he was absolutely a presence at the hotel during the 1920s and early 1930s, and his associates definitely used the building for various purposes related to their criminal enterprises. Capone understood the value of operating in plain sight, of conducting business in establishments that catered to Chicago's elite. Who would suspect criminal activity in a hotel that hosted presidents, that was known for its elegance and respectability? The Congress Plaza, with its grand ballrooms and distinguished guest list, was the perfect camouflage for mob business. Important meetings could be held in private dining rooms or suites, looking to outside observers like nothing more than legitimate business discussions or social gatherings. Several of Capone's employees and associates lived at the hotel on a long-term basis, occupying rooms for months or even years at a time. This provided the organization with a convenient and respectable base of operations. Messages could be delivered, meetings could be arranged, surveillance could be conducted, all under the cover of ordinary hotel activities. The hotel's complex layout, with multiple towers connected by corridors, underground passages, and numerous service entrances and elevators, made it ideal for discreet operations. According to local legend and stories passed down through hotel employees over the decades, the Congress Plaza was sometimes used to hold rival gangsters hostage during territorial disputes or business negotiations. The scenario would work like this. A rival gang member would be lured to the hotel under some pretext. A business meeting, a social event, a supposed opportunity for profit. Once inside, he would be taken to a room in a remote section of the building, perhaps one of the higher floors in a tower that was less busy, or a room that had been specially prepared for the purpose. There, he could be held for hours or even days, guarded by armed men, while negotiations took place with his organization. The hostage was leverage, a human bargaining chip to secure whatever deal Capone's organization was trying to make. If the negotiations succeeded, the hostage would be released unharmed and sent back to his people with whatever message needed to be delivered. If the negotiations failed, or if the hostage's organization refused to play along, the outcome could be much darker. Bodies could be moved out of the hotel just as discreetly as they had been moved in. Late at night, through a service entrance, perhaps in a large trunk or rolled up in a carpet, a body could be loaded into a vehicle and taken away for disposal. The Chicago River was convenient for such purposes, as were the many construction sites around the rapidly growing city, where a body buried in a foundation trench would never be found. Hotel staff who saw anything unusual would have understood that keeping silent was in their best interest. This was Chicago in the 1920s. People who saw too much or talked too much had a tendency to end up in the river themselves. How many people died in the Congress Plaza during the gangster years of Prohibition and the early Depression? There's no way to know for certain, and probably never will be. These weren't deaths that would have been reported to police, at least not with honest explanations of what had occurred. They weren't documented in hospital records or death certificates. The hotel's own records, if they mentioned such incidents at all, would have been deliberately vague or would have been destroyed long ago. The oral history that might have preserved details has faded as the people who were there have died themselves, taking their knowledge to their own graves. But employees whisper about certain rooms and certain areas that feel wrong, that generate more complaints from guests that staff members prefer to avoid when possible. The 8th floor, where Capone allegedly spent time, is one such area. Staff report feeling watched there, sensing presences that don't feel friendly or benign, hearing sounds that don't have obvious sources. Some refuse to enter certain rooms alone, especially during night shifts when the building is quiet and any unusual sound is immediately noticeable. The ghost associated with this era and these activities is called Peg Leg Johnny, as mentioned earlier. He's described as a haggard-looking man with one leg, either using a crutch or hopping on his remaining leg, appearing in the South Tower and vanishing when approached. The story usually told about him is that he was a homeless man who made his way into the hotel and was killed there, though whether by gangsters, hotel security, or some other cause is unclear in the various versions of the story. His ghost has been reported by numerous witnesses over many decades, appearing in hallways, stairwells, and occasionally in guest rooms. The distinctive sound of his irregular gait, the particular rhythm of someone walking with a prosthetic leg, has been reported by multiple staff members and guests who had no prior knowledge of the ghost story. They simply heard the sound, investigated, and found no source for it. Moving forward chronologically from the gangster era, there are more documented deaths, though the details become harder to verify as we approach more recent decades, when privacy laws and the hotel's understandable reluctance to publicize deaths on the property create gaps in publicly available information. Suicide is a recurring theme in hotel deaths generally, for reasons that make sad psychological sense. The anonymity of a hotel room, the distance from family and friends, the sense of being outside normal life. These factors can make hotels attractive to people contemplating ending their lives. Over 132 years of operation, across 871 rooms that have hosted millions of guests, how many people have killed themselves in Congress Plaza rooms? Dozens, certainly. Perhaps hundreds. Each one represents a private tragedy, a person in such despair that death seemed preferable to continuing life. Each one left behind family members with questions and grief, hotel staff who discovered the bodies and carried that trauma forward. And perhaps, if the paranormal theories hold any truth, some trace of that desperate energy absorbed into the room where it occurred. There are whispers and rumors about other deaths. A lawyer found dead in his room, bound and strangled, possibly the victim of a murder staged to look like a sex game gone wrong. A couple who made a suicide pact involving cyanide, found dead together in their room, their bodies discovered only when the smell alerted housekeeping. A woman shot by an intruder who broke into her room, a crime that might have been random violence or might have been a targeted killing. These stories circulate in the paranormal community, mentioned in books and on websites about haunted Chicago, shared in tour groups and investigation teams. Some of these stories are documented in police records and newspaper archives. Others seem to be elaborations or conflations of different incidents, details that have shifted and changed over the years until the truth becomes impossible to extract from a legend. This is the nature of folklore. Stories that start with a kernel of truth but grow and transform through retelling until they become something quite different for what actually occurred. The truth is that we'll never have a complete accounting of every death that has occurred at the Congress Plaza Hotel. Even the modern era, with careful record keeping, Not all deaths are public knowledge. A person who dies of natural causes in a hotel room, a heart attack, a stroke, any of the many ways the human body can suddenly fail, whose body is discovered by housekeeping and removed by paramedics, might make it into hotel incident reports, but not into newspapers or public records. Go back to the early decades of the hotel's history, when record keeping was less systematic, when there were fewer privacy protections, but also fewer requirements for public disclosure, when there were sometimes reasons to keep certain deaths quiet to protect the hotel's reputation or to avoid complicated investigations, and the picture becomes even murkier. What we can say with certainty is that the Congress Plaza has seen more than its share of tragedy over its long history. And whether through psychological suggestion, collective memory, or something more genuinely paranormal, these tragedies have created an atmosphere that guests and staff notice and comment on. There's a heaviness in certain areas of the hotel, a sense that the walls remember, that the rooms hold onto the emotions that have played out within them. Paranormal investigators who have studied the Congress Plaza extensively often talk about the distinction between residual hauntings and intelligent hauntings, and the hotel seems to feature both types. Corel running down the hallways might be residual. The hotel replaying a moment of childhood joy that occurred before tragedy struck, a recording that plays over and over without awareness or intent. The shadow man actively fleeing from the security guard and eventually vanishing on the roof suggests intelligence, awareness, purpose, consciousness that can perceive the present and respond to it. The hand pushing through the wall could be either residual or intelligent, depending on the interpretation. Is it a conscious attempt to escape from whatever fate befell the construction worker? Or is it simply the echo of a moment of panic, trapped in the fabric of the building and occasionally manifesting? The question of what is residual versus what is intelligent is important in paranormal theory. Though, of course, all of this exists in the realm of speculation, since we have no confirmed scientific understanding of ghosts or hauntings. And then there's room 441, which doesn't fit neatly into either category. The woman who kicks guests awake suggests intelligence, intention, awareness of the guest's presence, and a desire to interact with them. But the consistency of the reports, the way the same phenomena occur again and again in essentially the same patterns, suggests a residual element as well. Perhaps room 441 represents both types simultaneously, a space where past and present have become so entangled that the distinction between memory and consciousness no longer quite applies. All of these deaths, all of this accumulated trauma and emotion, all of these moments of fear, despair, rage, and grief have been absorbed into the building. The limestone walls 18 inches thick, the wooden floors that have been walked on by millions, the plaster ceilings that have heard countless voices and witnessed countless scenes, they've all been soaking in human experience for over a century. And if buildings can remember, if materials can hold imprints of powerful events the way some theories and traditions suggest, then the Congress Plaza must be saturated with memory, layer upon layer of joy and sorrow, celebration and tragedy, life and death. But of all the rooms in this vast hotel, one room stands apart as the focus of more paranormal activity, more consistent reports of unusual phenomena, more documented experiences that resist easy dismissal than any other. It's time to enter room 441 and try to understand what makes this particular space so different from all the others. Part 4. The fourth floor, inside room 441. The fourth floor of the Congress Plaza Hotel doesn't feel quite right. That's the first thing many guests notice, often before they even know about the floor's reputation or the stories associated with room 441. There's something subtly off about this level, something that doesn't quite register consciously, but that creates a vague sense of unease, of being somewhere that doesn't follow quite the same rules as the rest of the building. The lighting is one issue. The corridor leading to room 441 has the same overhead fixtures as other floors, the same sconces on the walls providing ambient illumination. But somehow the light doesn't seem to fall quite right here. There's shadows in corners that seem deeper than they should be, pools of darkness between the lights that your eyes don't want to focus on properly. Some guests report that this corridor is sometimes completely dark except for a single light at the very end, right by room 441's door, though hotel maintenance insists that all the lights are functional and on the same circuit, that there's no reason for some to be lit while others are dark. The carpet pattern is another subtle strangeness. Throughout the hotel, the carpet has been replaced and updated multiple times over the decades, with different sections getting new carpet at different times depending on where and available budget. This has resulted in a patchwork of different patterns and colors in different areas. But on the fourth floor, particularly in the corridor leading to room 441, the carpet seems to change mid-hallway in a way that doesn't quite make sense. You'll be walking on one pattern, then suddenly the pattern shifts, the colors change, and you're not quite sure when the transition occurred or why it would happen in the middle of a hallway rather than at a doorway or intersection. The architecture itself contributes to the sense of disorientation, because the Congress Plaza was built in stages over many years. The original North Tower in 1893, the first South Addition in 1902, the larger South Tower in 1907, and various other modifications and additions over the following decades. Different sections of the hotel don't quite match up. Floor heights vary slightly between towers. Corridors that should logically connect in straight lines instead turn at odd angles. What should be a simple walk from the elevator to your room becomes a journey through spaces that don't seem to follow Euclidean geometry. The fourth floor shows these architectural inconsistencies more than most other levels. Walking from the elevator toward room 441, you might notice that the decor changes partway down the hall in ways that suggest you've crossed from one section of the building to another. The wallpaper pattern shifts from a floral design to a geometric one. The light fixtures suddenly belong to a different decade. The ceiling height seems to change, though when you look carefully, you can't quite pinpoint where the transition occurred. It's like crossing a threshold between two different buildings that happen to occupy the same space, two different eras layered on top of each other. Some paranormal researchers believe that architectural inconsistencies like these can create what they call thin places, locations where the barrier between our normal reality and other states of being becomes more permeable. The theory suggests that when spaces don't quite make sense geometrically, when rooms are added in ways that violate the original building's logic and flow, energetic disturbances can occur. Think of it like crossing a border between countries. There's a transition zone where the rules aren't quite the same on either side, where you're neither fully in one place nor fully in another. Whether or not you accept that theory, there's no question that the fourth floor feels different from the other floors of the hotel. Employees acknowledge this, though often reluctantly, not wanting to sound like they believe in ghosts or are being superstitious. But they've all walked these corridors enough times to know which hallways feel normal and which ones make the hair on the back of their neck stand up. They know which rooms generate more guest complaints, more maintenance requests, more reasons to quickly finish their work and leave. They know that the fourth floor requires a certain mental preparation before entering, a kind of steeling yourself for whatever might happen. Room 441 sits at the end of one of these peculiar corridors, in a location that somehow feels more remote than it actually is. The walk to reach, it seems to take longer than the actual distance would suggest, as if space has stretched slightly along this particular path. Some guests report feeling like they're walking uphill, even though the floor is level. Others describe a sense of pressure building as they approach the door, as if the air is getting thicker, harder to move through. The door itself is unremarkable at first glance. It's constructed of dark wood, like most of the doors in this old hotel. There's a brass number plate with 441 engraved in classical numerals that have probably been there since the room was first created. A modern electronic lock requires a key card, part of an upgrade completed years ago when the hotel moved away from traditional metal keys. The door frame is slightly worn, showing the patina of over a century of use. There's nothing visually distinctive or unusual about this door. And yet, guests report hesitating before using their key card, as if some deep instinct is warning them to reconsider, to turn back while they still can. It's not a rational response. It's something more primal, the kind of unease that makes animals avoid certain places, that makes us instinctively uncomfortable in situations where we can't quite identify what's wrong, but know something isn't right. Take a deep breath. Slide the key card into the lock. The mechanism whirs and clicks. The light turns green. The lock disengages. Push the door open. Step inside. This is it. This is room 441. The room itself is larger than you might expect. One of the benefits of staying in a hotel built in an era when space was less expensive and rooms were designed for extended stays rather than quick overnight business trips. The layout is fairly standard for a hotel room. A queen-size bed against one wall, covered in standard hotel bedding in neutral colors. A desk with a chair positioned near the window, providing a workspace for business travelers. A dresser with a television on top, the screen dark and reflecting the room back at itself. A small seating area with an armchair upholstered in fabric that's meant to be inoffensive and forgettable. Heavy curtains cover the window, the kind designed to block out city lights and create the darkness needed for sleep. The bathroom is accessed through a door near the entrance. It's small but functional, containing a shower tub combination, a sink with a mirror above it, a toilet, all standard hotel fixtures that have been updated over the years, but remain fundamentally unchanged. The walls are painted in neutral beige, the kind of color designed to offend no one and make no impression. The carpet is patterned in a way that's meant to hide stains and wear. Everything about the room screams generic hotel space, the kind of impersonal accommodation you could find in any city, in any hotel, utterly lacking in distinctive character or memorable features. And yet, and yet, from the very moment you step inside and close the door behind you, you know you're not alone. It's not a feeling you can easily describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. The air has weight to it, a density, a presence, as if the room is holding its breath, waiting to see what you'll do, how you'll react to being here. The temperature seems wrong, not dramatically cold, not obviously different from the hallway you just left, but slightly off, as if the thermostat is set for a different season than the one outside the window. Set down your luggage. Walk to the window and open those heavy curtains, letting in the light from outside. The view is actually quite nice. Michigan Avenue stretches away toward Grant Park, with the lake visible beyond. At night, the city lights create beautiful patterns. The park a dark void with paths traced in light cutting through it. This view is one reason people request room 441 despite its reputation. It offers a good perspective on the city at a reasonable price. But turn away from the window and the room reasserts itself. The bed looks normal enough. Standard hotel mattress, clean sheets, pillows arranged just so by housekeeping. But dozens of guests over the decades have reported that sleeping in this bed is difficult. Not because the mattress is uncomfortable, but because they can't shake the feeling of being watched. Many describe waking suddenly in the night to find a dark figure standing at the foot of the bed or beside it, a female shape that vanishes when they fully wake or turn on the lights. The descriptions of this figure are remarkably consistent across different witnesses who had no prior knowledge of each other's experiences. She's described as a woman, though the age varies in different accounts. Some say elderly, others middle-aged. Her clothing is usually described as dark or old-fashioned, though rarely in enough detail to pin down a specific era or style. She doesn't speak, doesn't make sounds that witnesses report. She just stands there and watches with what witnesses describe as an intense, unsettling attention. Who is this woman? Unlike Carell Langer, whose identity we know from historical records, or Captain Ostium, whose death was documented in newspapers, the woman of room 441 remains completely anonymous. No death specifically associated with this room appears in any publicly available historical records. No accident, no suicide, no murder that would explain why this particular room hosts this particular presence. The hotel's archives, if they contain information about deaths in specific rooms, are not open to researchers or the public. This anonymity might actually make the phenomenon more frightening rather than less. With Carell, you can construct a narrative, a child who doesn't understand he's dead, still playing in the halls he knew in life. With Captain Ostium's Shadow Man, you can imagine a troubled veteran unable to move on from the place he died. But the woman in room 441 offers no such narrative comfort. She's simply there, without explanation, without known history, without any way to understand what she wants or why she remains. Some paranormal investigators have speculated that she might not be a single entity, but rather a composite, an accumulation of different female presences that have occupied this room over the decades. Perhaps multiple women died in this room across the hotel's history, from natural causes, from suicide, from circumstances lost to time, and their energies have somehow merged into a single manifestation. Or perhaps the room itself has developed a kind of personality over the years, and the female form is simply how it chooses to present itself to guests, the shape that consciousness takes when it tries to make itself known. The physical manifestations in room 441 go beyond just sightings of the figure. Many guests report being kicked in bed, hard enough to wake them suddenly from sleep. The sensation is unmistakable. A sharp impact to the legs or feet, the kind of kick that would come from someone standing at the foot of the bed, striking deliberately. When guests wake and turn on the lights, there's no one there. The room is empty except for them. The door is still locked from the inside. The windows are closed. There's no rational explanation for the sensation they just experienced. Others report having the covers pulled off them despite no wind or movement that could cause it. They'll be lying in bed, covered by sheets and blankets, when suddenly the bedding is yanked away with enough force to expose them completely. Again, when they look, there's no visible cause. Some report feeling weight on the bed, as if someone has sat down beside them, the mattress depressing under invisible mass. A few particularly disturbing accounts describe feeling something lying down beside them, the bed shifting as if to accommodate another person's weight, the sensation of presence so close they could almost feel breath on their face. The electronic disturbances in room 441 are well documented enough that skeptics have a harder time dismissing them as pure imagination or suggestion. The television turns on and off by itself, sometimes at specific times. 3 a.m. is frequently mentioned, sometimes seemingly in response to guest activity or conversation. The alarm clock will activate even when guests are certain they didn't set it, often going off at unusual hours like 3:17 in the morning. The lights flicker in patterns that don't match the random flickering that might result from faulty wiring. Instead, they pulse in what some describe as rhythmic patterns, as if someone is playing with the switch. One particularly unnerving phenomenon involves the bathroom faucet. Multiple guests across different years, people who had no knowledge of each other's experiences, have reported that the sink's faucet will turn on by itself, running for anywhere from a few seconds to a few minutes before shutting off again. This happens at random times, sometimes when guests are in the room and watching, sometimes when they return after being out for the day and find the sink wet, the faucet dripping, though they're certain they turn it completely off before leaving. The mechanical explanation for a self-activating faucet in a modern hotel would typically involve either a faulty fixture or pressure issues in the plumbing system. Old buildings can have quirky plumbing, with air pockets in the pipes or pressure fluctuations that can cause faucets to drip or even briefly run. But the hotel's maintenance staff report that they've replaced the faucet in room 441 multiple times over the years in response to guest complaints, and the phenomenon continues with new fixtures. Moreover, it apparently only happens in this room. If it were a building-wide plumbing issue affecting the system rather than a specific fixture, other rooms on the same water line would experience the same problem. According to maintenance records, they don't. The temperature fluctuations in room 441 are another physical phenomenon that's difficult to dismiss as pure imagination. Guests consistently report that certain areas of the room are significantly colder than the rest of the space. We're not talking about a slight difference you might not notice or might attribute to a draft. We're talking about areas where the temperature seems to drop 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit within a step or two, cold enough that you can feel it distinctly, cold enough that on a warm summer day, you might see your breath fog in that one spot while the rest of the room is perfectly comfortable. The cold spots appear most frequently in two locations, one corner near the window and an area by the bathroom door. These locations remain consistent across different reports from different guests who had no knowledge of previous accounts. Thermal imaging cameras brought in by paranormal investigators have captured these temperature differentials, showing clear cold zones that have no apparent source. Skeptics correctly point out that older buildings often have inconsistent heating and cooling, that air current from windows or vents can create pockets of colder air. But the consistency of the locations, the fact that these cold spots appear in the same places regardless of season or whether the heating or air conditioning is running, suggests something beyond normal building behavior. Objects in a room are reported to move, though not usually in the dramatic poltergeist fashion you might see in horror movies, with things flying across the room or levitating. Instead, guests describe more subtle displacements, placing their phone on the nightstand and finding it on the desk, hanging clothes in the closet and finding them on the bed, leaving room keys in one location and discovering them somewhere completely different. Skeptical explanations exist, certainly. People forget where they put things, especially in unfamiliar spaces. Hotel staff enter rooms for cleaning and might move objects. But the reports persist from people who were specifically watching for such phenomena, who photographed object positions before leaving the room and found them changed upon return, who stayed awake all night observing and still witnessed movement they couldn't explain. The auditory phenomena might be the most unsettling of all because they often occur when guests are alone in the locked room, in the quiet hours of the night when the building has settled and outside sounds have faded. Voices, usually described as whispers or murmurs, too low to make out specific words, but clearly not random building noise. Footsteps in a room when no one is walking, the distinctive sound of someone crossing the floor, approaching the bed, or moving around the space. The sound of the bathroom door opening and closing when it's visibly stationary, when you can see it hasn't moved, but you distinctly hear the sound of hinges creaking and the door latch clicking. Knocking on the door or walls with no source, sometimes a single knock, as if someone is testing to see if anyone will respond, sometimes a series of knocks, as if someone is seeking entry. One guest reported hearing what sounded like a woman crying, soft sobs that seemed to come from the bathroom. They got out of bed, went to investigate, opened the bathroom door expecting to find someone in distress. The bathroom was empty. The sound stopped the moment they opened the door, cut off as if a switch had been flipped. Another guest described hearing their name called out loud, clear enough that they answered, "Yes," before realizing they were alone in a locked room, that there was no one who could have called to them. These experiences accumulate over time, report after report spanning decades, creating a comprehensive picture of room 441 as a space where normal reality doesn't quite function the way it should. And here's what makes these reports particularly compelling from a paranormal research perspective. Many of them come from people who didn't know the room's reputation beforehand. In the age of the internet, that's becoming increasingly rare. Anyone booking room 441 today has likely Googled the room number and knows exactly what they're getting into. They're either paranormal enthusiasts hoping for an experience or skeptics wanting to debunk the myth for themselves. Their expectations inevitably influence their perceptions and interpretations of ambiguous stimuli. But there are accounts from earlier years, before the internet made information so readily accessible, from people who simply booked a room at the Congress Plaza through a travel agent or by calling the hotel directly, and happened to be assigned room 441. These guests had no cultural expectations shaping their perceptions because they didn't know there was anything unusual about the room. They checked in, went to their room, and experienced something, and what they reported experiencing matches remarkably well with what more recent guests report. The woman at the foot of the bed, the television turning on at 3 a.m., the bathroom faucet activating by itself, the cold spots in specific locations, the feeling of being watched. Without prior knowledge to shape their expectations, they describe the same phenomena that have now become the room's signature characteristics. This consistency across witnesses who had no knowledge of each other's experiences is powerful evidence, though of course not proof, that something genuinely unusual happens in room 441. Whether that something is paranormal in the traditional sense of ghosts and hauntings, or whether it has some other explanation we don't yet understand, the fact remains that the room behaves differently than other hotel rooms, that guests consistently report similar unusual experiences there. The hotel has never sealed room 441 off the way they allegedly did with room 666, or whatever space on the 12th floor has supposedly been hidden behind wallpaper and removed from the hotel's room inventory. Room 441 remains bookable, listed on the hotel's website, available for guests to reserve. However, the hotel is reportedly careful about who they assign to it. If you specifically request room 441, knowing its reputation and wanting to experience it for yourself, they'll accommodate you. If you're just looking for any available room and the hotel isn't completely full, they're much less likely to put you there. This is actually smart business practice. The hotel has learned that room 441 can be a draw rather than a liability. Paranormal enthusiasts from around the world specifically seek it out, willing to pay premium rates during busy seasons for the chance to spend a night in one of America's most allegedly haunted hotel rooms. These guests come prepared with ghost hunting equipment, cameras, audio recorders, electromagnetic field detectors, infrared thermometers, and various other devices designed to capture evidence of paranormal activity. They're hoping for unusual experiences, expecting them even, and based on the continued reports, they often get what they came for. But what about guests who don't want a paranormal experience? The business travelers just looking for a place to sleep between meetings? The families on vacation who want rest, not unexplained phenomena? The hotel tries to protect these guests by quietly steering them toward other rooms, by essentially removing room 441 from general availability during certain periods and only making it bookable by specific request. This creates an interesting dynamic where room 441 has become a destination in itself, separate from the general hotel experience. You don't accidentally end up there anymore, not in the way you might have in 1975 or in 1985 before the room's reputation was widely known. You choose it deliberately, and that choice, that intentional seeking of the unusual, might actually affect what happens next in ways that complicate our understanding of what's really occurring in the room. Paranormal researchers and skeptics debate endlessly whether expectation creates experience or simply makes people more aware of genuine phenomena they might otherwise dismiss. If you walk into a room expecting it to be haunted, primed to interpret ambiguous stimuli as paranormal, are you more likely to have unusual experiences? The answer is almost certainly yes. The human brain is a powerful pattern-seeking and meaning-making machine, desperate to find significance in random events, capable of constructing elaborate experiences from minimal actual input when expectation provides the framework. But Room 441's reputation is now so well established that it attracts not just believers, but skeptics, people who arrive determined to debunk the claims, who spend the night actively looking for rational explanations for every sound and sensation. And many of these skeptics leave with their certainty shaken, if not entirely overturned. Not necessarily convinced that ghosts are real, but unsettled, unable to fully explain what they experienced, left with questions they didn't have before they checked in. There's also the phenomenon of repeat guests, people who stay in room 441 multiple times over months or years. Some are paranormal investigators conducting long-term studies, trying to document patterns in the phenomena and gather evidence that might stand up to scientific scrutiny. Others are just ordinary people who found their first stay compelling enough to return, curious enough about their initial experience to want to see if it repeats or if they imagined or exaggerated what happened. What's interesting about repeat visitors is that they report both consistency and variation in the phenomena. The woman at the foot of the bed doesn't appear every night. The faucet doesn't always turn on. The cold spots aren't always present or aren't always in the exact same locations. Some nights, nothing unusual happens at all, leading guests to wonder if their previous experiences were just imagination or coincidence. But then, just when they're ready to write it all off as suggestion and expectation, something undeniable occurs. A chair visibly moves across the room while they're watching it. A clear voice speaks a word or name that they distinctly hear. The temperature drops so dramatically that they can see their breath fog in the air. This inconsistency is actually characteristic of reported hauntings generally, not just room 441. Ghosts, if they exist, apparently don't perform on command. The phenomena associated with allegedly haunted locations tend to be sporadic, unpredictable, frustrating for researchers trying to gather evidence or conduct controlled studies. But this very inconsistency makes the experiences more credible in some ways, at least to those inclined to believe. A hoax would need to be reliable, repeatable, theatrical enough to satisfy people who paid specifically for the haunted experience. The authentic paranormal, if such a thing exists, is apparently quite mundane in its manifestation, happening when it happens, indifferent to whether anyone is watching or documenting. This inconsistency is actually characteristic of reported hauntings generally, not just room 441. Ghosts, if they exist, apparently don't perform on command. The phenomena associated with allegedly haunted locations tend to be sporadic, unpredictable, frustrating for researchers trying to gather evidence or conduct controlled studies. But this very inconsistency makes the experiences more credible in some ways, at least to those inclined to believe. A hoax would need to be reliable, repeatable, theatrical enough to satisfy people who paid specifically for the haunted experience. The authentic paranormal, if such a thing exists, is apparently quite mundane in its manifestation, happening when it happens, indifferent to whether anyone is watching or documenting. Room 441 also provides a case study in how haunted locations accumulate stories and legends over time. The basic phenomena, the woman, the cold spots, the electronic disturbances, have remained remarkably consistent over decades of reports. But additional details have accreted around them, some based on actual experiences, others likely embellishments or misunderstandings that have been repeated so many times they've become part of the accepted narrative. You'll sometimes read that room 441 was where a specific murder occurred, or where a particular suicide took place, or where a woman died under mysterious circumstances that are described in dramatic detail. But when you try to trace these claims back to primary sources to verify them against historical records, they evaporate. The hotel's incident reports don't confirm these specific events. Newspaper archives don't contain the stories. The detailed origin tales don't hold up to scrutiny. This doesn't necessarily mean nothing happened in room 441. Hotels are generally reluctant to publicize deaths in specific rooms for obvious business reasons. Who wants to sleep in a bed where someone died? Records could have been lost or deliberately destroyed. Events from the early decades of the hotel, before systematic record keeping and before modern transparency requirements, might never have been properly documented at all. But it does mean we should approach overly specific origin stories with healthy skepticism, understanding that folklore has a tendency to create detailed narratives to explain phenomena, even when the actual historical facts are unknown. What we can say with confidence, based on the accumulated evidence from hundreds of witnesses over many decades, is that something about room 441 creates unusual experiences for a significant percentage of the people who stay there. Whether that something is genuinely paranormal, purely psychological, or related to some physical characteristic of the room that we don't yet understand scientifically, it appears to be real enough that it can't be completely dismissed as imagination or hoax. The room has a reputation earned through consistent reports rather than marketing or deliberate myth-making. The comparison to Stephen King's short story 1408 is often made, and while there's no confirmed connection, the parallels are interesting to consider. King's story, published in his 1999 collection, Everything's Eventual, tells of a haunted hotel room that doesn't contain the ghost of any particular person, but is itself malevolent, actively evil, a space that drives its occupants to madness and death through psychological torture rather than overt supernatural violence. Room 1408 in King's story has witnessed 56 deaths over the decades, but it's not haunted by those people. Instead, the room itself is the entity, using the deaths as fuel or trophies, feeding on fear and despair. Room 441 doesn't present quite that way in the reports we have. The phenomena described, while unsettling, aren't typically described as malevolent or actively harmful. The woman at the foot of the bed doesn't threaten or attack. The temperature drops are uncomfortable but not dangerous. Objects move, but they're not thrown with violence. Guests are kicked awake, but not injured. The overall impression from most accounts is of a space that's aware, that has developed some form of presence or personality, but not necessarily one with ill intent toward the living people who temporarily occupy it. This raises profound philosophical questions about consciousness, presence, and the nature of place. We're comfortable with the idea that consciousness resides in brains, that self-awareness and the capacity for perception emerge from the complex electrochemical interactions of billions of neurons. But what if consciousness, or something analogous to it, can arise from other types of complex systems? A building, particularly an old building with a long history, is itself an enormously complex system. Thousands of components interacting in precise ways, systems within systems, all interconnected and interdependent. Add to that physical complexity the presence of human consciousness moving through the space constantly over decades and centuries. Every person who enters a building brings their own consciousness, generates their own electromagnetic fields through neural activity, leaves behind traces of their presence in ways both obvious and subtle. Over enough time, with enough accumulated human experience, could the building itself develop something approaching awareness? Not human consciousness. Certainly, whatever a building might experience would be utterly alien to us, operating on different time scales, perceiving reality through different senses than we possess. But perhaps awareness nonetheless, a building-level consciousness that emerges from the accumulated complexity of structure, history, and the endless parade of human minds that have moved through it. This sounds like science fiction, like mysticism rather than serious inquiry. But consciousness itself remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of science. We don't really understand how subjective experience emerges from objective physical processes. The hard problem of consciousness. Why there is something it is like to be you, why subjective experience exists at all rather than just unconscious information processing, has no agreed-upon solution despite centuries of philosophical investigation and decades of neuroscientific research. If consciousness can emerge from the complex interactions of neurons in a brain, why couldn't something analogous emerge from the complex interactions of a building's systems, its materials, its accumulated electromagnetic signatures, its history of human occupation? The substrate is different, the mechanisms will be different, but the underlying principle might be the same. Sufficient complexity giving rise to something greater than the sum of its parts. Emergence creating properties that can't be predicted or explained by examining the components in isolation. Or perhaps the answer is simpler and more traditional. Perhaps ghosts are real in some form we don't yet scientifically understand. Perhaps consciousness can, under certain circumstances that we haven't identified, persist after physical death. Perhaps certain locations, due to their history or their physical properties or some combination of factors, attract or trap these persisting consciousnesses. The woman in room 441 might simply be someone who died in that room or nearby, who found herself unable or unwilling to move on, who remains bound to that space by ties of emotion or circumstance or simple confusion about what has happened to her. The truth is we don't know. After decades of paranormal investigation, thousands of hours of study by both believers and skeptics, countless attempts to measure and understand phenomena, like those reported in room 441, we still don't have definitive answers. We have theories, frameworks for thinking about these experiences. We have evidence that's suggestive but not conclusive, compelling to some but easily dismissed by others. We have experiences that feel entirely real and meaningful to the people who have them, but that can't be reliably reproduced or scientifically verified. And perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps some mysteries aren't meant to be solved completely, at least not yet with our current understanding and tools. Perhaps places like room 441 serve an important function by remaining uncertain, by challenging our assumptions about what's possible, by refusing to fit neatly into either the definitely real or definitely fake categories that we prefer for our peace of mind. Perhaps the value lies in the questions themselves rather than in any answers we might eventually find. The hotel that was still awake continues to fascinate because it sits in that uncomfortable space between the known and the unknown, because it offers just enough evidence to prevent complete dismissal, but not enough proof to force acceptance. It invites us to wonder, to question, to examine our own beliefs about reality and consciousness and the persistence of memory. And in that invitation lies its power, not in any particular ghost or haunting, but in its refusal to be easily explained away. Part 5. The Architecture of Spirits, Materials and Consciousness. To truly understand the haunting of the Congress Plaza and particularly room 441, we need to move beyond just the historical events and reported phenomena. We need to understand the building itself as a physical system, as a complex assemblage of materials, each with its own properties, arranged in patterns that create not just architectural space, but potentially something more. Channels for energy, resonance chambers for forces we don't fully comprehend, a physical infrastructure that might interact with consciousness in ways our current science hasn't adequately explored. Let's start from the ground up, literally, with the foundation upon which everything else rests. The Congress Plaza sits on Chicago's characteristic blue clay, that dense, stable soil that has supported the city's buildings since its founding. This clay is itself ancient, deposited during the last ice age more than 10,000 years ago as the glaciers that covered the region retreated, grinding rock into fine particles and leaving them behind as the ice melted. Beneath the clay lies bedrock, limestone and dolomite formations that extend deep into the earth, the compressed remains of an ancient sea that covered this region hundreds of millions of years ago. There's something poetically appropriate about building a hotel, a structure designed for temporary human habitation, on top of stone that is literally made from the permanent remains of ancient life. But it might be more than poetic. Limestone is sedimentary rock composed primarily of calcium carbonate, usually formed from the accumulated shells, coral, and skeletal fragments of marine organisms. Over millions of years, layer upon layer of these remains built up on the seafloor were compressed under their own weight and the weight of newer layers above, underwent chemical changes, and eventually transformed into the solid stone we quarry today. Some paranormal researchers and various metaphysical traditions believe that limestone, because of its biological origins and its crystalline structure, has particular properties when it comes to storing and releasing energy. The theory suggests that the regular molecular patterns in limestone crystals can capture and hold electromagnetic signatures, in ways that other materials cannot, functioning like a natural recording medium or memory storage system. Whether or not this has any basis in physics as currently understood, it's true that limestone has been preferentially used in sacred and important buildings throughout human history. From the Great Pyramid of Giza to medieval European cathedrals to countless temples and monuments worldwide. Either ancient builders recognized properties in limestone that we've forgotten, or there's a long tradition of attributing special significance to this material that persists despite having no objective basis. The Congress Plaza's exterior walls are constructed from massive limestone blocks, 18 inches thick in the original 1893 North Tower. These aren't thin facade elements. They're structural components bearing the weight of everything above them. Each block probably weighs several tons. Together, they form an enormous mass of stone, quarried from locations around the Midwest and transported to Chicago in the 1890s. Cut and fitted by skilled stonemasons, assembled into walls that have now stood for 132 years and will likely stand for many more. Stone masses this large can resonate at low frequencies when excited by vibration, producing infrasound. Sound waves below the range of human hearing, below about 20 hertz. We can't consciously hear infrasound, but our bodies can detect it, and research has shown it can have significant physiological and psychological effects. Exposure to certain frequencies of infrasound can produce feelings of anxiety, unease, the sensation of being watched, even visual hallucinations, or the perception of movement in peripheral vision. Some researchers have suggested that many allegedly haunted locations might be producing infrasound through natural processes. Wind blowing over chimneys or through gaps in buildings, traffic vibrations from nearby roads, structural settling, and that what people interpret as ghosts might actually be their body's responses to these inaudible sound waves affecting their nervous systems. The Congress Plaza, with its thick stone walls, its complex system of interior spaces creating various acoustic chambers, its location near busy Michigan Avenue, where traffic creates constant low-frequency vibration, could certainly be producing infrasound. This might explain some of the feelings of unease that guests report, the sensation of presence when no one visible is there, the anxiety that has no obvious source. It's a more prosaic explanation than ghosts, but it would account for real physical sensations that people experience. However, infrasound doesn't explain everything reported at the Congress Plaza. It doesn't explain cold spots that show up consistently in specific locations on thermal imaging. It doesn't explain objects that witnesses see moving. It doesn't explain faucets that turn on by themselves or electronics that malfunction in repeatable patterns. Infrasound might be part of the explanation, contributing to the overall atmosphere of unease, but it's not the complete answer to the phenomena reported here. Moving from a structure itself to its interior systems, the original construction used wooden joists and floorboards for the floors and ceilings. Much of this would have been replaced or covered over during various renovations over the decades, but significant amounts remain, particularly in the older sections of the building. What has its own interesting properties from both practical and metaphysical perspectives. It's organic, once living tissue, now dead and preserved. It responds dynamically to environmental conditions, expanding when it absorbs moisture and contracting when it dries out, changing dimensions with temperature fluctuations. This constant movement creates the settling sounds that all old buildings make, the creaks and groans that are perfectly normal, but that can sound eerie in the quiet of night. The Congress Plaza, with over a century of wooden components at various stages of aging, creates a symphony of these sounds. Each piece of wood has its own acoustic signature, responding to temperature and humidity changes in its own way, contributing its own notes to the overall soundscape of the building. But again, normal building sounds don't fully account for what guests report. The footsteps that approach but never arrive. The sound of doors opening when all doors are observably closed. The whispers and voices that don't match the random creaking of settling wood. These phenomena, if they're real rather than misinterpretation, require explanations beyond normal building behavior. The plumbing system deserves particular attention given how many of the reported phenomena in room 441 involve water, specifically that bathroom faucet that turns on by itself. The hotel's pipes carry water throughout the building in a complex network that has been updated numerous times over the decades, but that still includes sections of original piping from 1893. Water in pipes creates sound as it flows, the familiar rushing and gurgling that you hear when someone in another room turns on a faucet or flushes a toilet. These sounds can travel through walls and floors, carried by the pipes themselves, sometimes emerging in unexpected locations far from their actual source. But water is more than just a source of sound. It conducts electricity and can create and carry electromagnetic fields. Some paranormal theories suggest that running water, particularly in older plumbing systems made of metal pipes, can create conditions favorable to paranormal activity. The idea is that water's movement combined with the electromagnetic fields it generates might provide energy that discarnate entities could draw on for manifestation, or might create fluctuations in local electromagnetic fields that affect human consciousness and perception. There's no scientific proof for these ideas, but it's interesting to note how many paranormal hotspots involve water in some way. The Congress Plaza's phenomena frequently center around the bathroom. The faucet turning on, sounds coming from that area, the cold spot near the bathroom door. Whether this has anything to do with the plumbing and water flow, or whether it's just coincidence or pattern seeking by human minds, remains an open question. The electrical system presents perhaps the most intriguing element when considering potential mechanisms for paranormal phenomena. The hotel was originally wired for both gas and electric lighting in the 1890s, when electricity was still relatively novel and not entirely trusted as reliable. Over the subsequent 130-plus years, the electrical system has been updated multiple times, but like all renovations in old buildings, these updates have been layered on top of existing infrastructure rather than completely replacing it. The result is a complex web of wiring, some of it quite modern, some of it from the 1950s or 60s, some potentially even older, all of it carrying current through the building's walls and creating electromagnetic fields. Electromagnetic fields and paranormal phenomena have been linked in numerous studies and theories. Electronic voice phenomena, EVP, the capture of voices or sounds on recording devices that weren't audible at the time of recording, is one of the most well-known alleged paranormal phenomena. EMF, electromagnetic field. Detectors are standard equipment for paranormal investigators, used based on the theory that spirits either generate electromagnetic fields themselves or somehow affect existing fields in detectable ways. The Congress Plaza's electrical system, with its mixture of old and new components, its complex routing through thick stone walls, likely creates varying electromagnetic field patterns throughout the building. Some paranormal investigators who have studied the hotel report unusually high EMF readings in certain areas, including room 441. Skeptics correctly note that old, poorly maintained wiring can create strong electromagnetic fields without any paranormal involvement, and they're right. But the question remains whether these fields, regardless of their mundane origin, might somehow interact with human consciousness in ways that create experiences people interpret as paranormal, or whether they might facilitate actual paranormal phenomena through mechanisms we don't yet understand. The ballrooms deserve special attention as spaces that have witnessed enormous concentrations of human emotion and activity. The Gold Room, with its gilded surfaces and massive crystal chandeliers, its soaring ceiling and classical proportions, was designed to be a space of grandeur and celebration. But it's also an enormous resonance chamber where sound behaves in unusual ways, echoing and amplifying, creating acoustic effects that can seem almost supernatural. Staff report hearing piano music in the Gold Room when it's empty and locked, when there hasn't been a piano in that room for years. The Florentine Room is said to produce the sounds of roller skating, which makes historical sense as it was once converted into a roller skating rink for a period in the early 20th century, but makes less physical sense given that the floor has been completely refinished multiple times since then. These phantom sounds might be acoustic phenomena, residual echoes somehow trapped in the architecture and replaying under certain conditions. Or they might be psychological, employees hearing what they expect to hear based on the room's histories, their brains filling in sounds that fit the narrative. Or they might be genuinely paranormal, the residual energy of thousands of past events creating auditory impressions that persist in the space somehow, playing back like recordings embedded in the structure itself. The corridors of the Congress Plaza, particularly those confusing sections where different building phases connect, create their own category of strangeness. Because the hotel was built in stages over many years, the layout doesn't follow simple logic. Hallways turn at odd angles. Floor levels don't quite match up between sections. Decorative styles shift abruptly. The result is a space that's disorienting to navigate, that doesn't quite make geometric sense, where you can easily get turned around even after walking the same route multiple times. This architectural confusion likely contributes to the paranormal reputation. When we're disoriented, when we can't create a coherent mental map of the space we're in, we become anxious and unsettled. Our brains struggle to process what we're experiencing, and in that struggle, we become more susceptible to suggestion, more likely to interpret ambiguous stimuli as unusual or threatening. But there might be more to it than just confusion and anxiety. In folklore and esoteric traditions worldwide, there's a concept of liminal spaces, thresholds between one state and another where the normal rules don't quite apply. Doorways are liminal spaces, neither fully inside nor outside. Crossroads are liminal, neither one road nor another. Times like dawn and dusk are liminal, neither day nor night. These in-between states and places are traditionally considered locations where the boundary between the physical world and spiritual realms becomes thinner, where unusual things are more likely to occur. The corridors of the Congress Plaza, particularly those sections where different building phases connect, might function as architectural liminal spaces. They're not quite one building or the other, not entirely part of the 1893 structure or the 1907 edition. They exist in between, and in these in-between spaces, guests and staff report some of the most dramatic paranormal experiences. Shadow figures that appear and vanish, sudden temperature drops, the sensation of stepping through an invisible barrier into a space where reality works differently. All of these elements, stone, wood, water, electricity, acoustic properties, architectural complexity, combine to create a building that is far more than just a pile of materials shaped into rooms and hallways. The Congress Plaza is a complex system that has been absorbing and responding to human experience for 132 years, evolving and changing not just through deliberate renovations, but through the simple fact of use, of millions of people moving through it, sleeping in it, celebrating and mourning and living and dying within its walls. And in this complex system, Room 441 seems to function as a focal point, a location where all these properties and accumulated experiences concentrate somehow, where the barrier between normal and paranormal becomes particularly thin. Why this specific room? We don't know. Perhaps something about its location in the building, its relationship to structural elements, the particular combination of materials in its walls and floors. Perhaps something that happened there decades ago, an event powerful enough to permanently alter the room's fundamental nature. Or perhaps it's simply random chance, a statistical quirk in a building with hundreds of rooms and a long history. One room had to be the most active, and it happened to be this one. Whatever the explanation, Room 441 stands as a testament to the idea that places can be more than just locations, that the spaces we create and occupy can take on characteristics and presences that transcend their mere physical existence. Whether that presence is consciousness, residual energy, psychological projection, or something else entirely remains an open question. Part 6: Paranormal Investigations and Scientific Scrutiny. Over the decades since the Congress Plaza's haunted reputation became widely known, the hotel has attracted countless paranormal investigators, from amateur ghost hunters armed with consumer-grade equipment to professional research teams with sophisticated scientific instruments. These investigations have produced a substantial body of evidence. Though whether that evidence actually proves anything paranormal is a matter of heated debate that continues to divide researchers and skeptics. One of the most comprehensive investigations occurred in 2011 when a team from the American Ghost Society spent 3 consecutive nights documenting activity throughout the hotel, with particular focus on room 441, the 4th floor generally, and the Gold Room. The team brought equipment that has become standard in modern paranormal investigation. Multiple digital cameras capable of capturing both visible light and infrared spectrum, digital audio recorders for capturing electronic voice phenomena, electromagnetic field detectors calibrated to measure variations in ambient EMF, thermal imaging cameras that can visualize temperature differences across surfaces, and motion sensors to detect movement in areas being monitored. The investigation methodology was carefully structured to minimize false positives and eliminate mundane explanations before attributing phenomena to paranormal causes. Base readings were taken of every room and corridor to establish normal EMF levels, temperature ranges, and ambient sound levels. Equipment was set up to record continuously rather than just when something unusual was happening, providing context that could help distinguish genuine anomalies from normal building behavior or equipment malfunction. The results were mixed, as they often are in paranormal investigation, but certain findings were compelling enough to resist easy dismissal. In room 441 specifically, thermal imaging cameras recorded a cold spot appearing near the bathroom door that registered approximately 15 degrees Fahrenheit colder than the surrounding air temperature. This cold spot appeared suddenly, persisted for approximately 7 minutes, then dissipated just as suddenly. The thermal camera captured the entire sequence, showing the temperature differential as a clear blue zone in the otherwise uniform temperature field of the room. Skeptics would correctly note that old buildings can have drafts, that air conditioning vents can create cold zones, that temperature variations are normal. But the investigation team had already mapped all vents and known air flow patterns in the room. The cold spot appeared in a location with no vents, no windows nearby, no obvious source for such a dramatic and localized temperature change. Moreover, it appeared and disappeared far too quickly for normal HVAC-related temperature variations, which typically change gradually over minutes or hours rather than appearing and vanishing in seconds. EMF readings in room 441 showed unusual fluctuations that didn't correlate with any detectable electrical source. The room's baseline EMF reading was consistent with having electrical wiring in the walls and electronic devices plugged in. Nothing unusual. But during the investigation, several spike events occurred where the EMF detector registered sudden increases of 5 to 8 milligauss above baseline, holding steady for anywhere from 30 seconds to several minutes before dropping back to normal. These spikes occurred multiple times during the 3-night investigation, always in the same general area of the room near the foot of the bed. The team checked for possible mundane sources: cell phones, walkie-talkies, elevator motors, electrical panel activity, but found no correlation between the EMF spikes and any detectable source. This doesn't prove the spikes were paranormal, of course. Old buildings can have electrical issues that create EMF fields. Wiring problems, grounding issues, power fluctuations in the building's electrical system could all potentially explain the readings. But the pattern was unusual enough to merit attention. Consistent location, repeated occurrence, no obvious mundane source. Audio recordings produced what paranormal investigators call Class A EVPs, electronic voice phenomena that are clear enough to be understood without enhancement or interpretation, that multiple listeners can hear and agree on the content. During one recording session in the early hours of the morning, with the investigation team sitting silently in room 441, the audio recorder captured what sounds distinctly like a female voice saying "leave now" or possibly "please go." The voice is clear enough that it can't be dismissed as pareidolia, the human tendency to find patterns and meaning in random noise. It's a voice saying words. The skeptical explanation would be that the voice came from another room and was picked up through walls or ventilation systems. That hotel guests in nearby rooms were talking, and their conversation bled into the recording. The investigation team anticipated this objection and had researchers stationed in the rooms on either side of 441 and directly above and below it during recording sessions, specifically to monitor for sounds that could contaminate the audio. No one in those rooms heard speaking at the time the voice was recorded, and the voice doesn't sound distant or muffled the way sounds bleeding through walls typically do. It sounds like it's in a room. Another possibility is that one of the investigators subconsciously spoke without realizing it, or that someone whispered something that wasn't consciously registered but was captured by the recorder. This is harder to rule out completely, but the team was experienced and careful about maintaining silence during recording sessions, and all members were accounted for on video during this particular recording. None of them appear to speak. The most dramatic evidence captured during this investigation was a photograph taken in room 441 using a laser grid system. This technology projects a field of laser dots across a space, creating a reference grid against which any disturbance can be easily seen. If something moves through the laser field, a person, an animal, even a large insect, it will block some of the laser dots, creating a shadow or distortion in the grid pattern that shows up clearly in photographs. During one session at approximately 3:17 a.m., that time again, consistently reported in room 441 experiences. A photograph of the laser grid showed a clear distortion, a roughly human-shaped area where multiple laser points were blocked or displaced. The shape appears to be standing near the foot of the bed, consistent with where witnesses report seeing the female figure. The distortion is too large and too distinctly shaped to be an insect or small animal, and there were no humans in the area where it appears. All investigators were positioned in other parts of the room and are visible in the photograph. What does this photograph prove? Skeptics would argue it could be a camera artifact, a processing error, deliberate manipulation, or a million other things. Blurry, ambiguous photographs prove nothing because so many mundane explanations are possible, and they'd be right to be skeptical. But the image is compelling when combined with all the other evidence from the investigation. The cold spots, the EMF spikes, the audio phenomena, the consistent pattern of unusual activity. No single piece of evidence is conclusive, but the accumulation creates a picture that's difficult to dismiss entirely. Other investigation teams over the years have reported similar findings. A 2015 study conducted by researchers from the Rhine Research Center, an organization focused on parapsychology research that's been operating since the 1930s, used random number generators as a measure of potential consciousness affecting matter. The theory is that true random number generators, when monitored over time, should produce patterns that cluster around the mathematical expectation for randomness. But in the presence of consciousness or focused intention, some researchers claim the output becomes statistically skewed away from randomness in ways that shouldn't occur by chance. The Rhine team set up random number generators in several locations throughout the Congress Plaza, including room 441, and monitored them continuously for 72 hours. The generators in most locations performed as expected, producing random number sequences that showed no statistically significant deviation from expected randomness. But the generator in room 441 showed deviations that, while not enormous, were statistically unlikely to occur by chance alone. The pattern suggested some kind of ordering influence affecting the randomness, though what that influence might be remains undefined. This type of research exists at the controversial edges of science. Mainstream physicists generally dismiss consciousness-affecting matter experiments as pseudoscience, arguing that the effects reported are statistical flukes or result from flawed experimental design. Parapsychology researchers counter that the dismissal is ideological rather than scientific, that the effects are real even if small, and that they deserve serious investigation rather than automatic rejection. The debate continues, unresolved, with each side convinced of their position. Beyond professional investigators, hundreds of amateur ghost hunters have visited the Congress Plaza over the years, many specifically requesting room 441. They arrive with smartphone apps that supposedly detect electromagnetic fields or temperature changes, with cheap digital recorders looking for EVPs, with cameras hoping to capture ghostly apparitions. The quality and reliability of evidence from these amateur investigations varies wildly, from compelling to laughable, but the sheer volume of reports creates a kind of crowdsourced investigation spanning decades. Some patterns emerge from this accumulated amateur data. The time around 3 a.m. is consistently reported as the most active period, with phenomena peaking between 2:30 and 3:30 a.m. The area at the foot of the bed and near the bathroom door are the two locations where the most activity is reported. Electronic devices, phones, cameras, recorders, frequently malfunction or experience battery drainage in the room, far more often than in other hotel rooms according to multiple witnesses. These patterns could result from suggestion and expectation, with people experiencing what they've been primed to expect. But they could also represent genuine patterns in whatever phenomena are occurring, consistent signatures that appear across independent witnesses. The hotel itself has an ambivalent relationship with the paranormal investigation community. On one hand, the haunted reputation draws guests specifically seeking these experiences, providing a reliable stream of bookings for rooms that might otherwise be difficult to fill. On the other hand, too much focus on the paranormal could damage the hotel's reputation as a serious business venue and upscale accommodation. The hotel walks a careful line, acknowledging the ghost stories in a winking, "We've heard these tales, but make your own judgment" sort of way, while not officially endorsing or promoting paranormal activity. This ambivalence extends to how the hotel handles investigation requests. Small groups who book rooms and conduct their own private investigations are generally accommodated without issue. But requests to set up extensive equipment in public areas, to conduct formal investigations during busy periods, or to involve media coverage are typically declined. The hotel wants the benefits of its haunted reputation without the drawbacks of being seen as nothing but a ghost attraction. From a scientific perspective, the Congress Plaza presents both opportunities and challenges for studying allegedly paranormal phenomena. On the positive side, it's a location with a long documented history of consistent reports, making it an ideal site for longitudinal study. The phenomena reported are varied enough to test multiple theories and methodologies. The building itself is accessible, unlike some alleged haunted locations that are abandoned or difficult to access. The Congress Plaza is a functioning hotel where researchers can book rooms and conduct investigations. The challenges are equally significant. As an operating hotel, controlled conditions are impossible to establish. You can't seal off areas from all outside influence. You can't prevent hotel staff from entering and potentially contaminating investigation spaces. You can't control who else is in the building or what they might be doing that could create sounds, electromagnetic fields, or other effects that might be misinterpreted as paranormal. The building is old and complex, with countless potential sources of normal sounds, temperature variations, and electrical anomalies that can mimic paranormal phenomena. Moreover, the reputation itself becomes a contaminating factor. Everyone who stays at the Congress Plaza now, particularly in room 441, knows they're in a supposedly haunted hotel. This knowledge inevitably shapes their perceptions and interpretations. The psychological concept of confirmation bias. Our tendency to notice and remember evidence that confirms what we already believe while dismissing contradictory evidence is nearly impossible to eliminate when studying a location with such a well-established reputation. Despite these challenges, some researchers argue that places like the Congress Plaza are exactly where paranormal research should focus. Rather than searching for rare, isolated phenomena that are difficult to study, they suggest concentrating on locations where unusual events are consistently reported. If ghosts or paranormal phenomena exist in any form, these hotspots should provide the best opportunity for detection and study. The consistency of reports across decades, from witnesses with varying levels of skepticism and belief, suggests there's something worth investigating beyond just cultural folklore and a psychological expectation. The scientific community remains deeply divided on whether such investigation is worthwhile. Mainstream science generally considers paranormal research to be pseudoscience, a waste of time and resources that could be better spent on questions that have more plausible answers. The argument is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and no amount of ambiguous recordings, fuzzy photographs, or subjective experiences rises to the level of proof needed to establish that consciousness can persist after death or that buildings can be haunted. Paranormal researchers counter that science progresses by investigating phenomena that challenge current understanding, that dismissing entire categories of reported experiences without thorough investigation is itself unscientific. They point to historical examples where phenomena were initially dismissed as impossible. Meteorites were once thought to be folklore. Ball lightning was considered a myth. Even the existence of giant squids was doubted by scientists despite consistent reports from sailors. In each case, open-minded investigation eventually confirmed that the phenomenon was real, that witnesses had been accurately reporting something that science simply didn't yet understand. The truth is that we don't have definitive answers about what's happening at the Congress Plaza or in room 441 specifically. The evidence is suggestive, but not conclusive. The experiences are real to those who have them, but remain unproven to outside skeptics. The phenomena resist easy explanation, but don't compel acceptance of paranormal interpretations either. We exist in that frustrating middle ground where something seems to be happening, where the accumulation of reports and evidence can't be completely dismissed, but where proof remains tantalizingly out of reach. And perhaps, for now, that's where the mystery needs to remain. Not because we shouldn't keep investigating. Continued study using ever-improving technology might eventually provide clearer answers. But because premature certainty, either absolute belief or absolute denial, closes off the productive questioning that drives both scientific inquiry and personal wonder. The Congress Plaza and Room 441 invite us to sit with uncertainty, to acknowledge that we don't know everything about how consciousness works, how memory persists, how place and history and human experience might interact in ways our current frameworks don't adequately explain. Part 7. The Living Experience, Guest Testimonials and Modern Encounters. Beyond the formal investigations and scientific debates, the most compelling evidence for Room 441's unusual nature comes from the ordinary guests who have stayed there. People seeking a night's sleep in Chicago who found themselves experiencing something unexpected, something that challenged their assumptions about reality. These testimonials, collected over decades from online reviews, paranormal forums, and interviews, paint a remarkably consistent picture while remaining deeply personal and subjective. Sarah Martinez, a business consultant from Dallas, stayed in room 441 in October 2019 with no prior knowledge of its reputation. She'd booked the Congress Plaza because it was convenient to her client's office and fit her budget. When she checked in and was given the key to 441, the front desk clerk asked if she was sure she wanted that room, an odd question she didn't fully process at the time. I thought maybe there was something wrong with it, like the air conditioning didn't work or the bed was uncomfortable. She later wrote in a detailed account of her experience. The first night passed without incident, though Sarah noted that she didn't sleep particularly well, kept waking up for no reason. The second night, she woke at exactly 3:17 a.m. She remembers the time clearly because she checked her phone with the absolute certainty that someone else was in a room with her. "I know how that sounds," she wrote. "I know everyone says I felt a presence in ghost stories, and it sounds like imagination. But this was different. This was as real as if another person had walked into the room and was standing there breathing. I could almost hear breathing, almost feel the air displacement of someone standing at the foot of my bed." Sarah turned on the bedside lamp, her heart pounding. The room was empty. She got up, checked the bathroom, looked in the closet, verified that the door was still locked from the inside. Nobody there. She tried to rationalize what she'd felt as a dream or sleep paralysis, but she knew she'd been fully awake. Eventually, she turned off the light and tried to sleep again, but every time she started to drift off, that feeling of presence returned, keeping her awake until dawn. The next morning, she mentioned the experience to a colleague, who immediately asked if she was staying in room 441. When Sarah confirmed, the colleague pulled up articles on her phone about the hotel's haunted reputation. "I felt such a weird mix of validation and fear," Sarah recalled. Validation because other people had experienced the same thing, so I wasn't losing my mind. But fear because if all these people were experiencing it, that meant it was real, and I had to spend another night in that room. She requested a room change, which the hotel accommodated without question, suggesting they're well accustomed to such requests. Her final night in a different room on a different floor was completely uneventful, just normal hotel sleep. confirming that the experience in 441 wasn't just about her psychological state or general anxiety about travel. James Chun, a software engineer from San Francisco, had the opposite approach. He specifically booked room 441 in summer 2021 because he wanted to experience the paranormal phenomena firsthand. "I'm a skeptic by nature and by training," he explained in a post on Reddit's paranormal subreddit. "I don't believe in ghosts, but I'm also scientifically minded enough to know that not believing in something doesn't mean it can't exist, and that personal experience is how we test our beliefs." James arrived prepared with equipment, an EMF detector, a digital thermometer, and 3 different recording devices, including his phone and 2 dedicated digital recorders. He set up the devices around the room in positions where they'd captured different audio perspectives, took baseline measurements of temperature and electromagnetic fields, and then settled in to wait for something to happen. For the first several hours, nothing did. "I was starting to think the whole thing was just collective suggestion, people psyching themselves out," he wrote. Then around 11 p.m., one of his recorders turned off by itself. Not ran out of battery. Turned off, as if someone had pressed the power button. He turned it back on, checked the battery, full, and continued recording. 20 minutes later, it shut off again. At this point, James reports feeling the first hints of unease. "I kept telling myself it was a malfunction, that I should have bought better equipment. But I'd used these recorders for months with no issues." He decided to leave the recorder off and rely on the other devices. Around 1 a.m., the temperature in one corner of the room, near the bathroom door, dropped noticeably. His thermometer, which he'd positioned on the desk, registered 68 degrees. When he walked over to that corner with a second thermometer, it showed 54 degrees, a 14-degree difference in the space of a few steps. "That freaked me out more than anything else," James admitted, "because I could feel it. It wasn't just the thermometer. I could feel the cold on my skin, that distinct sensation of stepping into a refrigerator. And there was no rational explanation. The window was across the room. The AC vent was on the opposite wall. There was no source for that cold. The cold spot persisted for about 10 minutes, then dissipated. James's EMF detector, which had been reading 0.3 milligauss consistently all evening, suddenly spiked to 7.5 milligauss in that same corner shortly after the cold spot faded. I walked around the entire room with the detector, trying to find a source, checking outlets, the TV, the bathroom lights, everything. The high EMF reading was localized to that one spot, about a 3-foot diameter circle, with no electrical source anywhere near it. By this point, around 2 a.m., James reports that his skepticism was seriously challenged. He'd come expecting to debunk the stories, to find mundane explanations for everything. Instead, he was experiencing phenomena he couldn't explain. "I wasn't scared exactly, but I was definitely unsettled. Everything I thought I knew about how reality works was being questioned." The night's culmination came at 3:19 a.m. James had dozed off in the chair, the events having exhausted him mentally, if not physically. He woke suddenly to a sound. His bathroom faucet was running. I could hear it clearly, that distinctive sound of water flowing from a tap. I got up, went into the bathroom, and sure enough, the cold water was running full force. I know for a fact I hadn't turned it on. I'd been asleep in a chair across the room. He turned off the faucet, returned to the chair, and sat there for the rest of the night, too wired to sleep. When he reviewed his recordings the next morning, he found multiple EVPs, unclear sounds he couldn't identify as definitely paranormal, but also couldn't explain as normal building noise. The most intriguing was a sound that he describes as like someone sighing or exhaling, very close to one of the recorders. James's conclusion after his night in room 441 was cautious, but shifted from his original skepticism. I can't prove ghosts are real based on this experience. There could be explanations I'm not aware of, phenomena I don't understand about old buildings or electromagnetic fields, or how temperature works in complex structures. But I can't explain what I experienced using normal physics as I understand it. I came away convinced that something genuinely unusual happens in that room, even if I can't definitively say what that something is. Not all experiences in room 441 are dramatic. Many guests report more subtle sensations, a vague unease, difficulty sleeping, strange dreams, the feeling of being watched. These accounts are harder to evaluate because they're so subjective, so easily attributed to suggestion and expectation. But their consistency adds to the overall pattern. Even people who don't experience obvious phenomena, like moving objects or temperature changes, often report that the room feels different from other hotel rooms, that something about it is subtly off in ways they can't quite articulate. Then there are the staff members who work at the hotel who have spent years or even decades walking these corridors, cleaning these rooms, responding to guest requests. Their testimonials are particularly valuable because they have extensive experience with what's normal in a hotel setting and what isn't, because they've been in hundreds or thousands of hotel rooms and can compare room 441 to all those others. Maria Rodriguez has worked as a housekeeper at the Congress Plaza for 23 years. In an interview conducted in 2020, she spoke about room 441 with a mixture of matter-of-fact acceptance and lingering unease. That room is different, she said simply. I've cleaned every room in this hotel at some point. 441 is different. The air feels heavier there. You don't want to stay longer than you need to. Maria reports several specific experiences that have stayed with her. Once, while cleaning the bathroom, she clearly heard footsteps crossing the bedroom behind her, assuming the guest had returned. She called out that she'd be finished in just a moment, but there was no response. When she came out of the bathroom, the room was empty, the door still showing the electronic lock engaged from her entry. No one could have entered without a key card. I left right then, she said. Didn't finish cleaning. Told my supervisor I'd come back later. Another time, she was making the bed when she felt what she describes as a hand pressing on her shoulder, as if someone was getting her attention. She spun around expecting to see the guest or a colleague, but she was alone in the room. It was a very clear sensation, not imagination. Someone touched my shoulder, but there was no one there. When asked if she believes the room is haunted, Maria is careful in her response. I believe something happens there that I don't understand. I don't know if it's ghosts or what. I'm Catholic. I believe in the soul. I believe in life after death. But I don't know if that's what this is. I just know that room makes me uncomfortable in a way the others don't. Other staff members echo similar sentiments. Security guards report hearing the piano music from the gold room when it's locked and empty. Maintenance workers have stories of tools going missing in certain areas only to reappear hours later in different locations. Front desk staff know to ask guests specifically requesting room 441 if they're aware of its reputation, to avoid the angry complaints that come from guests who didn't know what they were getting into. The hotel's management maintains a careful official neutrality on the subject. They don't advertise the paranormal activity. You won't find "stay in our haunted room" promotions on their website, but they don't deny it either. They acknowledge that some rooms have reputations, that guests report unusual experiences, but they stop short of confirming or endorsing supernatural explanations. It's a pragmatic position that allows them to benefit from the paranormal tourism interest while maintaining credibility as a serious hotel. What's perhaps most telling is what doesn't happen at the Congress Plaza. Despite decades of reported paranormal activity, despite room 441's specific reputation, the hotel has never attempted to remove the room from service, to permanently close it off, to structurally alter it, to somehow break whatever pattern creates the phenomena. This suggests either that the management doesn't believe the reports are credible enough to warrant such drastic action, or that they've decided the room is more valuable as an attraction than it would be if sealed away. Compare this to other allegedly haunted hotels that have made different choices. The Queen Mary in Long Beach has sealed off some areas considered too actively haunted. The Stanley Hotel in Colorado, which inspired Stephen King's The Shining, has embraced its paranormal reputation so completely that ghost tours are a primary draw. The Congress Plaza occupies a middle ground, acknowledging but not promoting, accommodating but not exploiting, maintaining room 441 as a bookable room while quietly accepting that it will generate unusual reports. The guest experiences in room 441 and throughout the hotel represent a form of crowdsourced evidence that's both compelling and frustrating. Compelling because the sheer number of consistent reports from independent witnesses makes complete dismissal difficult. Frustrating because subjective experiences, no matter how sincerely reported, can never constitute proof in a scientific sense. We're left weighing probabilities. How likely is it that hundreds of people across decades would independently report such similar experiences if nothing unusual were occurring? But also, how likely is it that consciousness persists after death and manifests in hotel rooms? The answer depends on your prior beliefs, your framework for understanding reality. For some, the accumulated testimonials are convincing evidence that something genuinely paranormal occurs at the Congress Plaza. For others, they're interesting psychological phenomena, group suggestions, cultural expectations, misinterpretations of normal events, but not evidence of ghosts. And for many, the truth lies somewhere uncertain between these extremes, a space of "I don't know," but something seems to be happening that I can't fully explain. And so, our journey into the mysterious affair at the Congress Plaza Hotel and room 441 comes to an end. We've traveled together through 132 years of the hotel's history, from its grand opening at the 1893 World's Fair to the present day. We've examined its architecture and materials, its deaths and legends, its witnesses and skeptics, its scientific theories and paranormal events. We've tried to understand what it means for a place to be haunted, whether by real ghosts or simply by the weight of accumulated memory and experience. Perhaps we've learned that certainty is often exaggerated, that the most intriguing questions are often those we can't answer definitively. We've learned that Congress Plaza has an extraordinary history that would make it fascinating even without ghost stories. Presidents shaped American politics from its rooms. Gangsters conducted their dark dealings in its corridors. Families celebrated their joys, and tragedies unfolded within its walls. We've learned that Room 441 earned its fame not through marketing exaggeration or deliberate legend-making, but through decades of consistent reports. Most importantly, we are reminded that reality can be stranger and more complex than our everyday assumptions suggest, that the boundaries between past and present, consciousness and matter, the living and the dead can be more permeable and blurred than we often take for granted in our daily lives. The Congress Plaza Hotel stands patiently and eternally on Michigan Avenue, welcoming its new guests while preserving the memories of those who came before. Room 441 awaits its next occupant, ready to offer the experience that will emerge from the mysterious interplay between space, history, anticipation, and everything that can reside within those walls. Mysteries persist, questions remain unanswered, and perhaps that is precisely how it should be. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the shadows and mysteries of the Still Awake Hotel. If you enjoyed this exploration, I would be very grateful if you would consider subscribing to our Mystic Sleep Tales channel. Your subscription helps us continue creating these journeys into the unexplained, these bedtime stories for curious minds who find peace in contemplating mysteries rather than fear. I wonder where, and when you're listening to this, are you drifting off to sleep in the early morning hours? Are you getting into bed as evening falls? Perhaps you're in a hotel room, or maybe a room with its own stories to tell. Please leave a comment specifying your location and time. There's something wonderful about imagining we're all scattered across the globe, connected by our shared curiosity about the unexplained. And if there are any mysteries, haunted places, or historical riddles you'd like me to explore in future episodes, please share them in the comments. Your suggestions guide these journeys. Sweet dreams, dear friends. May your sleep be deep, your dreams filled with wonder. Wake up feeling rested, perhaps carrying a little reminder that the world contains more mysteries than we can explain, more possibilities than we can imagine. Until next time, this is Mysterious Sleep Stories, where the unexplained meets the threshold of sleep and mysteries await discovery in the quiet hours. Good night.